I'd like to call the hearing to order this morning, and the title today is the hearing on the Quadrennial Energy Review and related discussion drafts, including Title III, Energy Diplomacy. We'll have two panel of witnesses this morning, and of course on the first panel we have our Secretary of Energy, Mr. Moniz, who's no stranger to this committee or to Congress, so we appreciate him being with us very much. Look forward to his opening statement, and then we'll have some questions relating to his testimony as well as other issues. And at this time, I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Everyone is very much aware that this subcommittee and the Congress has been working on a bipartisan energy bill for several months now. Many people are even asking, not surprisingly, is there enough common ground between our efforts and the Obama administration to enact meaningful energy legislation? And I do believe that this question was answered with a clear yes when the Department of Energy's first installment of its Quadrennial Energy Review was released last April. This detailed study focuses on the infrastructure implications of America's new energy boom, and many of its recommendations overlap with provisions of our draft energy bill. And so we are excited that Mr. Moniz is here today so that we can explore the perspective of the Department of Energy as the country makes dramatic changes in its energy distribution, production, transmission system. We have a lot of infrastructure needs. We're focusing on the diplomacy aspects of energy, which is becoming more and more important to our friends in the European Union, who find themselves reliant on natural gas coming from Russia. And so we have many opportunities in the United States to come forth with a good energy policy. And I think that most of the provisions that we're focused on in this energy bill, Democrats and Republicans agree that they need to be addressed. And one of the biggest is infrastructure needs and trying to improve the permitting process, for an example. So I look forward to the testimony of all of our witnesses today, and we have a real opportunity here, and we don't want to drop this ball. So we're getting close to the end of drafting this legislation, coming up with a final product, and we look forward to moving it in a meaningful way. And at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for his opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today on the QER, and as well as on a variety of other energy issues covered in the discussion draft. Mr. Chairman, let me first begin by welcoming the Honorable and Distinguished Secretary of Energy, Mr. Moniz, here to the subcommittee today. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, let me commend you for the outstanding work you have been involved in on a myriad of different issues, all important to the American people. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, you might not accept this. You might not. You might think that this is not something that you seek, but in my mind and in the mind of a number of my constituents, you are indeed a superstar secretary, and we're proud of your work on behalf of our nation. Mr. Secretary, from your leadership in the historic nuclear talks with Iran to establishing the much-needed minorities and energy initiative at DOE, to overseeing the development of the comprehensive QER, are among your more important accomplishments. And I have no doubt that you will go down as one of the most significant and effective energy secretaries of modern time. You see, I'm a fan, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, as you may be aware, I have a bill that I will soon be introducing that will amend the Department of Energy Organization Act to replace the current requirement for a biennial energy policy plan with a quadrennial energy review. It is my hope that this bill, like its Senate counterpart that was recently introduced by Secretary Coons of Delaware and Senator Alexander of Tennessee, will attract bipartisan support. In fact, Mr. Secretary, I have held off on introducing the bill as of yet so that my office can continue to hold talks with the majority side in order to find language that both sides can agree on. And, Mr. Chairman, I will continue to reach across the aisle for support on this nonpartisan issue of codifying a quadrennial energy review, and I hope that we can find common ground. Mr. Chairman, the QER addresses many areas that are also covered in the discussion draft of the comprehensive energy bill we have all been working on. Issues such as increasing the resilience, reliability, and safety of the grid are discussed in both packages. Additionally, there are many similarities in both the QER and the discussion draft regarding integrating North American energy markets, modernizing the grid, and enhancing employment and workforce training. However, Mr. Chairman, there's still much work to be done in bridging the gap in areas where there are some disagreements, such as in siting and permitting and addressing the environmental aspect of transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure. Specifically, in the discussion draft before us today, I have some concerns regarding the cross-border approval process described in Section 3104. Under this section, the burden is shifted away from private companies and onto agency officials to issue a so-called certificate of crossing unless the official finds the project, and I quote, is not in the public interest of the United States. Another concern that I have, Mr. Chairman, is in Section 3102, which sets up an interagency task force to evaluate North American energy flows. However, the task is noticeably missing representatives from either the Council on Environmental Quality, the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the Departments of Interior or Transportation, among others who may weigh in on environmental issues. Mr. Chairman, as we move forward with the goal of putting forth a truly bipartisan energy bill, it is my hope that the majority side will work with our side to find common ground on most of these issues and put precedents in doing the right thing above doing it quickly. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush, for that opening statement. At this time, I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say in response to Mr. Rush's comments, I look forward to working with him and Mr. Pallone and all of our members on both sides of the aisle to do this right, and appreciate those kind words. We're delighted to welcome back Secretary Moniz to the committee to discuss the first installment of the quadrennial energy review that focused on energy transport and infrastructure, something we need to do. America's energy picture is rapidly changing, and our laws and regulations need to change with it. Long-standing concerns about declining domestic energy output have been erased by rapidly rising oil and natural gas production. 2013 alone, according to the QER, the U.S. added 1.2 million barrels per day of production, a record increase by one country in 1 year. Domestic production of natural gas and related liquids has experienced equally dramatic increases. 2014, the U.S. became the world's #1 energy-producing nation, and it's time that we start acting like it. Unfortunately, the scarcity mindset is still embedded in our national energy policy. Rising energy production requires more energy infrastructure, what I have called the architecture of abundance. Both the energy legislation and the QER include a number of ideas for upgrading and expanding the nation's energy infrastructure. And in light of the recent pipeline spill in California, I would add that both aim to ensure that this new infrastructure is built with state-of-the-art technologies that reduce the environmental and safety risks. But our energy abundance can be more than just an economic success story. It indeed can be a foreign policy success story as well. And that's why recently released discussion draft of our energy diplomacy title is so important. The discussion draft builds on the extensive work done by this subcommittee on LNG exports. At numerous hearings over the last couple of years, we heard from many of our allies around the globe who said they would rather get their natural gas from us than the likes of Russia or Iran. That message was underscored last month when I led a high-level delegation to several of our European allies, including Ukraine. And we came away with a profound new understanding of just how vital these partnerships can be. In established parts of the EU, leaders are coming together to promote a unified energy market because of its potential for security, affordability, and innovation. In Ukraine, where the commitment to freedom and democracy is hard-fought each and every day, their energy aspirations are fundamental to their dreams for a peaceful future. While our discussion draft encourages North American energy cooperation and cross-border infrastructure, opportunities for energy diplomacy extend well beyond our own continent. For example, there is broad recognition that the U.S. LNG exports will benefit the U.S. economy, our consumers, and yes, our allies. While the same could be said for oil exports, a statutory ban has prevented us from pursuing these benefits for the last 4 decades, and it's time that Congress considers revising the ban on crude oil exports. Amen. As with natural gas, America now has enough oil production to make increased exports feasible, especially the lighter grades of crude that the QER notes have experienced the most rapid supply increases. Economic and foreign policy experts across the political spectrum believe that expanding the markets for American oil would be a net jobs creator at home while enhancing our geopolitical influence abroad. And at the same time, reports from the GAO, CBO, and Energy Information Administration all point to reductions in the price of gas as a result of increased oil exports. In other words, oil exports can be a win for the American people and a win for our allies. The energy sector has been the nation's most significant job creator in recent years. But with the drop in oil prices, as many as 100,000 energy industry positions have been lost. The case for creating more jobs by expanding the market for American oil is a key reason why oil exports should be on this committee's agenda this year. And while we're not currently considering any such provisions in this pending legislation, I do look forward to working with my good friend Mr. Barton and others on both sides of the aisle to ensure that we get the policy right. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Rush. Let me begin by welcoming Secretary Moniz back to the committee and congratulating you on completing the first installment of the Quadrennial Energy Review. It's a truly comprehensive look at our nation's energy infrastructure, and its recommendations will help us chart a path forward in the rapidly changing energy sector. This installment relates to the transportation, storage, and distribution of energy. These TS&D connections between suppliers and users can impact our energy reliability and security and affect our ability to meet environmental and economic goals. TS&D infrastructure is vulnerable to a wide and expanding array of threats, from natural disasters to physical and cyber attacks, so it's important we thoroughly understand these vulnerabilities and how to mitigate their impacts. At the same time, its modernization can help achieve meaningful greenhouse gas reductions and other environmental goals while enhancing safety, security, and reliability. Ultimately, the OER represents the forward thinking we need to ensure a smarter, more resilient, cost-effective, and environmentally sound energy system for the future, and I look forward to working with you, Mr. Secretary, to translate these important ideas into legislation and law. I wish I could be as upbeat in discussing the majority's energy diplomacy discussion draft. Rather than building on the strong relationships with our North American neighbors, the majority has chosen to resurrect controversial legislative proposals that have already drawn Democratic concerns and presidential veto threats. For example, the bill would eliminate the current presidential permitting process for liquid and gas pipelines and electric transmission lines that cross the U.S. border with Mexico and Canada, and it replaces the process with one that effectively rubber stamps permit applications and eliminates any meaningful environmental review. While now it would only take effect after President Obama leaves office and specifically excludes the Keystone pipeline, it still appears to allow TransCanada to avail itself of the new process by reapplying with a revised route. The provision also limits federal approval and environmental review to the small segment of a project that physically crosses the national border. It also creates a rebuttable presumption that these projects are in the public interest, shifting the burden of proof to project opponents. This all but guarantees permit approval and virtually eliminates the opportunity for protective permit conditions. The draft bill also recycles LNG export language designed to address non-existent delays at the Department of Energy. In fact, DOE recently testified, and I quote, that right now there are 0 applicants sitting in front of us for a decision. The last application that came out of FERC, we turned that around in 1 day. Nonetheless, the bill would make changes to an otherwise successful process. And finally, another provision would create a task force burdening federal energy regulatory actions with additional red tape and undermining environmental considerations. In fact, it speaks volumes that the very agencies tasked with natural resource and environmental management like EPA and DOI are excluded from the task force. So I hope this committee can start to work towards consensus legislation instead of resurrecting problematic issues of the past. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That concludes the opening statements for today. And, Mr. Secretary, once again, thank you for joining us. We do look forward to your insights on these important issues, and I'd like to recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Upton and Whitfield, and ranking members Pallone and Rush.
I'm not sure the microphone is on, but
the light is on. Yeah. Okay. Start again. Okay. Well, again, Chairman Upton and Whitfield and ranking members Pallone and Rush, distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be with you again today. And I really appreciate the leadership that this committee has shown in working towards comprehensive and bipartisan energy legislation that includes many of the topics in the QER first installment. I look forward to working with you to move these ideas forward, and really appreciate in the opening remarks the statements about common ground and the opportunities we have to work together. As was already stated, the U.S. has reaped enormous benefits from our energy revolution the last several years, which I point out includes, of course, hydrocarbon production, but also dramatically increased renewables deployment to energy productivity gains. This revolution, however, has produced changes that are challenging our energy infrastructure, and to be direct, we need to modernize and transform our energy infrastructures and our shared commodity infrastructures. This will require major new investments, and we have to get it right. We should acknowledge that while the choices we make and the decisions we take today and in the near future are critical, we also have to acknowledge that the choices and decisions that we fail to take in a timely way are very important for generating our infrastructure for the 21st century. To help guide these investment choices, the QER provides recommendations based on a 15-month multi-agency process that included 14 public meetings across the country and consultations with Canada and Mexico. The QER focuses on TS&D, including the network of pipelines, wires, storage, waterways, railroads, and other facilities that form the backbone of our energy system. I ask the Chairman's permission to submit the summary version of the QER into the record. The full QER is available online, and you have my written testimony, so let me just take the opportunity to highlight 5 crucial tasks that we need to take. First, our infrastructure investments can and must serve energy security in a broader sense than the oil-centric focus of the last several decades. An example is found in the definition of energy security that the U.S. and our G7 allies developed after the Russian aggression in Ukraine. That includes 7 critical elements in a modern view of energy infrastructure. Supply diversification, for sure, but also transparent markets, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, enhanced efficiency, clean energy, infrastructure modernization, and emergency response. This doesn't mean that global oil disruptions are not a concern. Indeed, in the context of the QER and its recommendations, modernizing the SPRO, both from a physical distribution standpoint as well as the authorities for its use, is a major area of focus. Through its analysis of resilience and infrastructure modernization, the QER goes beyond global oil supply disruptions as the single focus of energy security policy, leading, for example, to recommendations related to regional fuel disruptions, as we have seen across the country. More coordinated state planning is also essential, and most notably, we feel that state planning grants to help states update and expand their emergency preparedness and security strategies and exercises to enhance electricity reliability, to accommodate several changing factors are all critical. Other ways to improve energy security include programs to make our energy infrastructures more resilient to a range of hazards and vulnerabilities. These are addressed in part through the QER's recommendation for a pre-disaster hardening grant program, options for transformer reserves, and a systematic program to replace aging, unsafe natural gas distribution pipes. Second, QER and its recommendations underscore the indispensable role of states. These really are test beds. We need to advance studies such as a new framework for evaluating energy services to help things like rate structure development. Third, the QER analysis showcases the importance and complexity of how our energy revolution challenges our shared transport infrastructures. Frankly, when we started the QER, we did not anticipate that we would end up with this as a major area of focus. However, the dramatic oil production increases in unconventional locations, coupled with things like the RFS and pending exports of natural gas, have placed strains on those transport infrastructures, rail, barge, locks, port facilities, and the like. The QER includes recommendations focused on innovative funding mechanisms for these infrastructures and, for example, recommends a program for port connectors being stressed by new energy supplies. Fourth, the QER recommends coordinated efforts for skills training and recruitment of workers to build and staff our modernized energy infrastructure system and support jobs for working families. A national job-driven skills training system with rigorous curricula and standards that includes a special emphasis on training for veterans, on minorities in energy, is critical to our energy future. I might note that yesterday, 85 minority interns started working at DOE for the summer. I also created a job strategy council to look at how we can capture the energy sector opportunities that we have for new jobs. And finally, fifth, we need to acknowledge the critical federal role in incentivizing our energy infrastructure investments. While the bulk of the QER recommendations fall under this committee's jurisdiction, the Congress has other committees with equities in energy infrastructure, especially in shared infrastructure and North American energy integration. I will just note in closing that the administration's most recent budget request includes a down payment for funding some of the QER's key recommendations at about $500 million. However, in the current budget environment, where sequestration has placed artificial caps on spending, DOE's programs and the shared infrastructure programs for the Corps of Engineers and others, frankly, place these critical programs in competition with very restricted budget allocations. And so, for example, the House Appropriations mark does not meet our needs for energy infrastructure. In closing, Department of Energy and all the agencies that developed this report and its recommendations see great potential for benefit, and we look forward to working with this committee again to find bipartisan ways of advancing our TS&D infrastructure. Thank you. I'll be pleased to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Secretary Moniz. And at this time, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of statements and questions. We all recognize that the Clean Energy Plan has been at the very center of President Obama's initiatives. And I think everyone recognizes that the tension between the Obama administration and Republicans in the House and Senate, as well as elsewhere, has been, many of us feel that the President is moving so quickly through regulations without adequate communication with the legislative body. And while we all recognize the need for an all-of-the-above policy, emphasizing clean energy, we look at Europe and we see how some policies over there, in which countries like Germany have made decisions to eliminate nuclear energy, has created low wholesale prices, extremely high retail prices, and as a result, Europe has some real economic problems. So what we want to be sure about in America is we made this mad rush for change, that we do so in a way that we can protect the reliability, the affordability, so that America can continue to be competitive in the global marketplace. Mr. McKinley, who left, was just telling me that in West Virginia they've lost 45% of their coal jobs. And so this economic impact affects all of us. And that's why we're trying to move this energy bill. That's why the quadrennial energy review is so important, to look at all aspects of everything, because everyone knows that we're fortunate. We have an abundant energy supply, natural gas particularly, and oil as well. But we have infrastructure needs, and it's very difficult to get permits. It takes years. And so as we're shutting down coal plants through regulatory orders, we don't always have the capability to get the energy product to where it needs to go. And so that's what this is all about. So one of the things I just wanted to ask you, you were talking about the development of this first installment was a colossal undertaking with at least 22 agencies involved and more than a year of work. And if this is the first installment of the QER, will there be a new installment each year for the next 3 years, and then the process will begin all over again? Is that what your understanding is? No. Yeah, there you go.
Apologize. So this first installment, frankly, did take us a few more months than we had hoped. We are now in the process of working across the government to settle on the next installment. We would like to get something into your hands early next year again, and then again at the end of 2016.
Mm-hmm. Now,
and clearly, this will be now expanding into the supply and demand ends of the energy sector.
Yeah. And my time is already running out here. I want to focus on one issue, because I was in the railroad industry, but railroads provide a vital transportation network for all sorts of commodities in America. And historically, railroads have generated lots of income from moving coal. And the coal shipments have dropped dramatically, even though our coal exports are up, even despite problems of trying to open up coal export facilities in Washington State. But many people are genuinely concerned about the financial viability of the railroad industry with this extreme reduction in coal transportation. Was that discussed in the quadrennial review process from your personal knowledge? Was there any discussion about that at all?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Of course, the Department of Transportation would have prime responsibility in that area, but there were discussions, because we did see in some cases, especially in the upper Midwest, some coal shortages for a while, but it was not because the trains weren't operating. They were just carrying other commodities, which my understanding may have had a higher margin for them. So one of the initiatives that we have taken, and the DOE EIA is working with the Surface Transportation Board at DOT, is to first of all to try to get more data, an understanding of how commodities, including energy commodities, are moving on the railroads, because it is coal, it's obviously oil, and it's and ethanol competing in a certain sense with a whole variety of other commodities. But I think more data and data transparency will be very important for federal and state planning.
Because we do have to have a strong financial railroad sector just because of the impact it has on our entire economy. So my time has expired. At this time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Rush for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as I asserted in my opening statement, I believe that you will go down as one of the most consequential energy secretaries of our time. And again, I want to commend you on your fine work and the initiatives that you have established during your tenure. And as you know, Mr. Secretary, when one attempts to change the culture and the practices of institutions that have been doing things a certain way for a long time, then inevitably there will be resistance and apprehension when those entities are asked to change. And it's with this in mind, Mr. Secretary, that I ask you to follow up with me to gauge where we are with some of the initiatives that you and I have discussed before in the past. Specifically, I would like to discuss with you the issue of inclusiveness and outreach at the publicly funded national labs, including but not limited to Argonne and Fermi in my state. And my office will be in touch with you to schedule a meeting for sometime in the very near future between you and I. It is my opinion, Mr. Secretary, that they are Argonne and Fermi specifically are thinking and fumbling on the issues of inclusiveness and outreach. It seems to me that they're trying to run out the clock on you and I. They're not seriously taking our requests and our initiatives and our discussion to heart. Mr. Secretary, on another issue, I would like to get your thoughts and feedback on the QER legislation that was introduced in the Senate. And I, as I said before, I will be offering a companion bill in the House soon. As you know, Mr. Secretary, this bill would simply amend the DOE Organizational Act to replace the current requirement for a biennial energy policy plan with a quadrennial energy review. And can you give the subcommittee some feedback on this bill? From your understanding, would DOE take the lead in the drafting of QER, and is there a need for legislation such as what I previously discussed?
Thank you, Mr. Rush. Yes. By the way, on the consequential issue, I hope they're positive consequences. I might also at this point say that I think our Energy Policy and Systems Analysis Office did a heroic job in marshaling this huge QER forward. On your first question, and culture, et cetera, I might add that there's a wonderful expression by Peter Drucker, the famous management consultant, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. We can change rules, but it's hard to change culture. But I think we are certainly making advances, certainly on the issue of minorities and energy. And if you know otherwise, I'd like to discuss it with you, because I do see enthusiasm going forward. Argonne, for example, one of their initiatives is in terms of making sure that minority businesses are quite aware of the opportunities for procurement. We also have and Dot Harris has been a leader in our place-based initiative. So a good example is working, in this case, in southwest Louisiana, with the enormous construction going on driven by natural gas for training minorities to get some of those jobs. In terms of research collaborations, another example would be our Jefferson Lab working closely with Hampton University. I mentioned the interns already. So we're going to keep pushing on all these fronts, and I want to work with you on that. And if you find problems, let me know, because I will be sure to.
I certainly will, Mr.
Okay,
Secretary.
thank you. Secondly, on the QER and the possibility of legislation, let me say that I certainly share the driver of this, which is that I think, and by the way, the initial reaction to the QER, including in this hearing, I think suggests that institutionalizing this could really be very important for continuing a bipartisan administration Congress discussion. So I'm happy to work with both chambers in terms of how that might go forward. I would just say that Department of Energy in this first installment clearly did provide kind of the analytical horsepower for it, but I do want to note that the Executive Office of the President also played a crucial role in being able to convene 22 agencies to come together to work on it. So anyway, we'd be happy to discuss that further.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Thanks again, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in my opening, I reaffirmed the desire of this committee to work with you and the administration to find areas of mutual agreement on some QER legislative recommendations, and we look forward to that, receiving technical assistance on some of the other sections of the bill as well. One of the areas that I wanted to zero in at is SPRO this morning. As I noted in your response to the committee yesterday, the SPRO was established in 1975, and it's the largest government petroleum reserve in the world. It has been used successfully on multiple occasions to respond to different types of energy supply disruptions, but it is now 2015, and global and domestic oil markets have changed significantly. We would all recognize that, and SPRO needs to be modernized. So as you know, the committee recently voted to draw down a limited amount of SPRO oil to pay for our 21st Century Cures package beginning in 2018. As you conduct the ongoing study to recommend the new size and role of SPRO going forward, would you support an additional change that would allow the President to draw down and sell surplus SPRO crude oil in order to use the funds to pay for operations and maintenance in line with the DOE budget requests and potential modernization plans? In other words, using what we call mandatory savings to provide for the modernization and needed improvements that really have to take place in the next number of years. And I would imagine that would be a pretty small drawdown.
Mr. Chairman, well, first of all, as you know, I have some considerable concern about using the SPRO for anything other than energy security and resilience issues for which it is intended. Now, the issue of first of all, I have to say the issue of what is or might be called surplus, I think, is really part of the study going on, because we understand that there are certain IEA requirements, but that may or may not be the metric for us to use. That's the first thing. Secondly, we did identify, of course, in the SPRO, in the QER, excuse me, needs right now for modernizing the SPRO, well, there is the issues of maintenance, there are issues of modernization, and in particular issues of addressing distribution systems for getting SPRO oil onto water, in particular in an emergency. We estimated that as $1.5 to $2 billion. That's part of the discussion with Congress, how to address that. Clearly, what you propose would be a case in which, if one were to do that, it would be being used, I would argue, for the energy security intent of the petroleum reserve.
So, as you know, the QER recommends more flexibility and anticipatory authority to initiate a SPRO drawdown. Do you envision a greater role for SPRO to moderate global prices?
The motivation for recommending somewhat greater anticipatory authority is not motivated by a desire to use the SPRO to manipulate oil prices. The issue is that the current anticipatory authorities are highly restrictive, up to 30 million barrels, and only if that keeps you above 500 million barrels. So there are issues there, and we feel that that should a larger drawdown be required, or if the SPRO were at 500 million barrels, one shouldn't have to wait to see the consequences on consumers of a spike in global oil prices before one can act. So I think that's the spirit, as opposed to manipulating oil prices.
So I would note as the QER discusses, the last time SPRO had a major release was in reaction to Libya, was back in 2011. Seems like yesterday, but it was 2011. Since then, the supply situation has greatly changed for sure, as demonstrated in the test sale this last year. If there is an interruption somewhere in the world that doesn't impact the supply to U.S. refiners, would it make any sense at all to export SPRO crude?
Once again, I would say that should be part of the study, that studies really that we are going on. But I might say that it's hard to see how a major global disruption would avoid impacting our imports, because again, we still import 7 million barrels a day, only because with a major disruption, even if that, let's say, country is not directly importing to us right now, there would probably be a redistribution of the market that would impact our imports. But nevertheless, hypothetically, if that were the case, I think there would still be an issue of putting SPRO out would have the effect of backing out imports that would then equilibrate in the global market. So we could discuss that further.
My time has expired. Thank you very much for your appearance again today.
This time I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, climate change, as you know, is real, and we're already feeling its effects across the country. The damaging impacts range from heat waves and droughts to reduced crop yields and increased wildfires. Every region of the country and every part of the globe is affected. I'm concerned about impacts of extreme weather events and sea level rise on our already problems that we have with our energy infrastructure. So my question is, the QER outlines a number of findings in this area. How is your energy transmission, storage, and distribution, or TSC&D infrastructure, vulnerable to the impacts of climate change?
Thank you, Mr. Pallone, Chairman Pallone. First of all, as the data in the QER show, we have been seeing increasing impacts, probably impacting the economy at the order of $25 billion a year on average over the last decade. And with rising sea level, the effects of storms, major tropical storms, for example, are amplified. So we feel it is very important now to address the hardening of these infrastructures, not only coastal, but coastal is one major issue. And that's why we recommend a joint set of initiatives. One is to provide energy assurance grants for states to do planning, and to provide a basis for the states to then compete for what we recommend as a several billion-dollar opportunity for these hardening kinds of activities. I'll give one example. It happens to be in New Jersey. It was not out of the recommendations here, but in New Jersey, there was the case where we cost-shared with the state a study on implementation of a very significant microgrid to protect electrified transportation corridors. The state then used that study to compete for Sandy recovery money and in fact got several $100 million to implement that. That's the kind of thing. Do these studies, get technical assistance, and then have the opportunity to move forward with cost-sharing major resiliency projects.
Well, I appreciate your mentioning our New Jersey grant because, obviously we did have a lot of vulnerabilities during Superstorm Sandy. We saw a breakdown of infrastructure and services, both electricity and water supply. But in terms of this competitive grant program that, is going to promote innovative solutions for infrastructure, resilience, reliability, security, just give me a little more information about how that program would work. I know you mentioned the New Jersey program, but what other kinds of projects would be eligible for those grants?
Well, it could be, again, any kind of project that hardens infrastructure. The electric grid has clearly shown vulnerability to storms. So it could be things that, like I mentioned, with microgrids. It could be the use of advanced technologies. I could mention some things like synchrophasers that would allow system operators to respond much more quickly to something that is happening, to protect spreading of a blackout, for example. It could be in terms of fuels requirements. One of the recommendations that we have in there is to expand analyses of what different kinds of regional product reserves might do. Now, this is a case where, again, in the Northeast and New Jersey,
right,
we've already moved there, but there are issues in California, there are issues in the Southeast, there could be issues in the upper Midwest, and so we recommend that, and there could be opportunities there for new resiliency projects.
All right, thanks a lot. I do want to applaud you for your efforts to strengthen these vulnerable and critical energy infrastructures, especially in the face of global climate change. So thanks again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time,
if I might just add that this is an example of the importance of the broader view of energy security, including resilience of our infrastructure.
Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, welcome back. Mr. Rush and you seem to have a mutual admiration society going. Superstar Energy Secretary. I wouldn't
get jealous.
Do what?
No, do not get jealous.
I do not get jealous. Well, I wouldn't go quite so far as superstar, but my daughter has a saying that she learned in college: when something's really cool, it's money. And it's money. When you say it's money, it means that, man, that's hot and it's cool and it's right on the beam. Well, I'd say Moniz is money. So, not superstar, but money. Now, you know what I'm going to give you a chance to show just how money you are. What do you think I'm going to ask you right now?
I don't know, but I'm covering my wallet.
Door number 1. You heard the chairman's opening statement. He talked about oil exports, and as you well know, Mr. Secretary, back in the 70s we had the Arab OPEC embargo, and this committee and the Congress passed a lot of legislation to deal with that, most of which has been repealed. We had price controls on the wellhead natural gas prices. We had price controls on crude oil. We had even retail price controls on gasoline. We limited what natural gas could be used for. That's all been repealed. The only thing that hasn't been repealed is the ban on crude oil exports. Now, the U.S. is number 1 in the world in oil production, over 10 million barrels a day. World uses somewhere around 94, 95 million barrels a day. Would you agree that if we were to let our domestic oil potentially be exported, that it would, at a minimum, keep prices from going up on world markets, and it's a possibility that the world oil price might go down? Would you agree with that?
I think the key issue, Mr. Barton, is whether or not in a country like ours that still imports 7 million barrels a day, the question would be whether that did or did not stimulate any appreciable additional production. I mean, that would be the issue in terms of global price. Internally, there would be an issue as to how rents are shared between, say, refiners and producers. But in terms of the economy-wide, the real issue was whether there's more production. And certainly in today's market, it's hard to imagine that happening. Now, a future market...
I'm not a Harvard economics professor.
Nor am I.
But I did go to graduate school, and if we want to talk about sharing of rents, our refiners are taking those rents and putting them in their pockets today. They're not sharing those with the retail consumers. If we let the producers have the option of putting that oil on the world market, the consumer in the United States could potentially benefit from the world price going down. And I think you'll agree with me that retail gasoline prices are basically set based on the world price for crude. You'll agree with that.
Absolutely, yes. The EIA has confirmed that.
So I have a list here of studies where they've looked at what the price would what would happen to the price in the United States at retail for gasoline. And the Brookings Institute, NERA, Resource for the Future, Council on Foreign Relations, Bipartisan Policy Center, Baker Institute, Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, Energy Policy Research Institute, Aspen Institute, Progressive Policy Institute, IHS Energy, ICF, International Heritage Foundation, American Council for Capital Formation, Congressional Budget Office, Energy Information Administration, General Accounting Office, Federal Reserve Bank, have all concluded that if we allowed our oil to be exported, there would be no increase in the domestic price for gasoline, and in most cases it might go down. Now, those aren't oil company hacks. Those are bipartisan, usually, I'd say, objective institutes. Are you aware of those? You've got to be aware of some of those studies.
Oh, yeah, yes. And again, I think they're all in agreement with the fundamentals that, again, the issue is whether or not such a move would lead to an increase of production of any appreciable magnitude.
Well, if
it doesn't, then there's essentially no impact on price.
My time is expired, but if you'll send one of your crack aides to the Republican Study Committee Task Force on Energy seminar this afternoon, you'll hear 4 or 5 experts all say that if we allow our oil to be exported, U.S. production will stabilize and probably go up.
And that, again, that's the key issue. I think we all agree on the facts.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time, Chair, recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I do appreciate the big effort that went into producing this QER document. Nice work. The document does recommend legislative actions. Would you elaborate on 1 or 2 of the most urgent actions that would be required?
Well, certainly, I think one of them very important ones that I already mentioned is this issue of providing funding, particularly for states to compete for good projects that will provide resiliency of infrastructure. I think that's a very important one. Another one is we recommend a fund that again would allow for competition for accelerating the modernization of natural gas distribution infrastructure for both environmental and safety reasons. Clearly, the federal government should not and cannot pay for what may be a $250 billion bill, but what we recommend is acceleration in which the federal government could help absorb any rate increase for low-income families. Those are 2 examples of a number.
Very good. One of the things that's discussed is the potential for energy storage and grid modernization, grid resilience. Do you think that there's a short-term potential for that energy storage to be useful in grid resilience and in lowering the cost and improving access for renewables and so on?
Yes, well, in fact, we all know California is in the lead, as is often the case, in terms of storage. And clearly, except for the places geographically where pumped storage is available, we still need to bring down the costs of storage, but they are coming down. They could be a game changer in terms of large-scale variable renewables, but also distributed storage at the household or commercial enterprise level could be another game changer, particularly in terms of distributed generation enablement.
Are we pretty close to having the technology available?
Well, the technology is available. It's the cost, and we probably need another factor of 2 to 3 reduction in the cost to make it widespread available.
Well, thank you. Do you feel that the regional grid reliability would be put at risk by the Clean Power Plan?
Well, we don't see any evidence in our analyses yet that this could not be managed in a pretty normal way. For example, we did a specific analysis in terms of the natural gas transmission infrastructure because of the issues raised in terms of dramatically expanding gas use in the power sector, and that found that while one would probably have some regional issues to develop, that it was not like we needed a massive program, because we actually have been building out that infrastructure pretty substantially for the last 15 years, and frankly, there's overcapacity. So we don't see that as as a particularly difficult issue.
Any way to deal? What would be the best way to deal with the regional question then that you just referred to of grid reliability?
I think it would be just in the normal process as the supply distribution is understood in that region. The companies would go through the usual FERC process for, let's say, interstate gas transmission pipes.
Well, there seems to be a patchwork of transmission siting initiatives across federal agencies. The QER highlights the need to improve coordination between all the stakeholders for transmission permitting processes. Do you believe that the rapid response transmission team has been effective, and should its role be expanded?
I believe that it is. What I would say is I think it's really gained traction. It's been, in my view, I'll be honest, I think it's a little bit slow getting going, but I think now the whole pre-application standardization is kind of come into play, and I think that we do need to, in fact, keep up the pace, and if anything, strengthen it. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and welcome Secretary Moniz. My first question is about the Federal Power Act. Under Section 202C, DOE can order a power plant to stay running during a grid crisis. In following your order, the plant might squeak past the clean air permits. Unfairly, that plant can be fined and sued by others for doing so. One regulator says go, another says stop. That plant has to decide whether they want to acquiesce in a power shortage, maybe a brownout or blackout, or cut a check for breaking the permit for just a few days, maybe a few hours. I have a bipartisan bill with Representative Doyle in Green to fix this in the energy package we're working on. This is not about a company running roughshod over environmental laws. We're talking about days or hours in a crisis. The other week, FERC and NERC endorsed our bill. Your predecessor, Secretary Chu, told me in this committee that he is, quote unquote, very supportive of the idea. The bill has passed this committee 3 times now, in the whole House twice, in the 112th, 113th Congress. And so my question for you is, can I count on your support in the 114th Congress? Will you be very supportive of the bill like your predecessor?
Yeah, Mr. Olson, thank you. You've asked me this question before, and let me say that the answer is basically yes. I know our DOE staff has worked with both sides on this, and I think we're quite comfortable with it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. As you know, my home state of Texas has half our southern border, over 1,200 miles with our neighbor to the south of Mexico. And we know that important that relationship with Mexico is for our trade. Your QER points out that we trade tens of billions of dollars in energy each year with Mexico.
65.
65. I like that even better. In fact, some of Texas' only power line connections outside of ERCOT come from our neighbor to the south, Mexico. You might recall that those lines prevented rolling blackouts and brownouts with the crises in the fall, in the spring, the early winter of 2011 and August of that same year. My question is, we know that oil and gas, those plays, shale plays, don't stop at the southern border. New administration in Mexico is reforming its energy economy. I think those opportunities will expand in the future. Your QER, our energy package, will address the topic of North American energy. I believe better coordination and trade will be critical in the years ahead. My question is, can you please tell me what you see as the next major opportunities for North American energy and where that relationship is headed?
In particular, I would say actually last week I spent 4, I want to emphasize, work days in Mexico with Western Hemisphere and other energy ministers. The energy reform in Mexico, I think, offers tremendous opportunities for us. Clearly, in the hydrocarbon sector, we know that our companies are going to Mexico in the current auctions and are prepared to offer lots of technical assistance to get engaged in the shale plays as well. However, in discussions with Minister Joaquin, the energy minister of Mexico, he has emphasized something that I agree with, and that is that the reform of the electricity sector may actually offer qualitatively new opportunities, because the reform, I think, will bring our systems of regulation, et cetera, and standards much more into alignment, as we have with Canada, where we have a completely integrated electricity system. So we are looking forward to that. It's going to be a major focus. We have both a bilateral working group that I chair on the American side with it's a multi-agency group with the Minister of Environment in Mexico, Minister Guerra, and then I also am one of the 3 chairs of Canada, U.S., Mexico trilateral energy ministers, and we are already well along into a trilateral data cooperation. And just last week, we have a release that went out. I'd be happy to get it to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Where the 3 of us announced that we are now going to expand the cooperation,
Right.
the full agenda laid out, which will include things like emissions and hydrocarbon production and energy infrastructure issues. So it's a very, very active.
Thanks, I'm out of time. Wednesday invitation, come down to see your work at MIT in your current position. The Petronova project in Thompson's, Texas, the only viable carbon capture, enhanced oil recovery project in the whole world. Come down and see it. You'll love it. I yield back.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you'll get an overdose of Texas. I see my colleague Joe Barton's not here, but I don't know if our members heard that his mom passed away last week, and I just wanted to express regret to Joe. Mr. Secretary, welcome back. According to DOE website, for projects that cross the U.S. international border, DOE must comply with NEPA requirements to consider environmental consequences of proposed projects. Mr. Secretary, are you familiar with that requirement?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
When making cross-border decisions, does DOE adhere to NEPA regulations and guidelines set forth by the Council on Environmental Quality? Mm-hmm. Does this include cumulative indirect impacts?
I'm sorry, Mr. Green.
Does that
clarify the question?
When making these decisions, the DOE adhere to NEPA regulations and guidelines set forth by CEQ? And you said that yes, but does that analysis include cumulative and indirect impacts? Does the NEPA process include that?
I guess I'm not quite sure if that's actually part of the NEPA process or not.
Okay. CEQ requires...
I mean, clearly there are, in general, when we make public interest determinations,
Yeah.
cumulative impacts are part of that.
Okay. CEQ requires an environmental impact for major federal actions significantly affecting the quality of human environment. Is it reasonable to conclude that DOE would require an environmental impact for a cross-border project, an EIS?
Oh, absolutely. We always require an EIS, yes.
Would DOE consider approval of a cross-border project a major federal action? I'm getting down to the whole...
Yes, all right.
CEQ has determined that NEPA applies to significant federal actions and can't be avoided by segmenting a project. So that means that a project coming across from Texas to Mexico, not just a cross-border crossing, but the project itself. Would DOE decision-making on cross-border segments of a cross-border project require compliance with NEPA?
Certainly. I mean, we always require NEPA compliance.
The discussion draft in the bill would eliminate the presidential permit process and grant cross-border decision-making to DOE for electric transmission facilities. If this draft were to become law, the DOE would be charged with promulgating a rule to implement the granted decision-making. Is it reasonable to conclude that any DOE issues new regulations, these regulations would include NEPA requirements about the cross-border project?
Well, if I might take a step back, I think there's two principles that we would always insist upon. I mean, one is proper environmental review, and secondly would be a judgment that this is in the public interest. I mean, I think those are the two basic principles.
Okay. There's language in Section 3104 of the bill that would limit the department's ability to fully comply with NEPA requirements. Do you believe that that language is needed?
Well, again, clearly, I think we need to make sure that the environmental requirements are met. So if the bill, if the proposal would curtail that, then obviously I would not support it.
Are you familiar with what's called the federal NEPA small handle issues?
No, I'm not.
Okay. If federal small handle issues relate to how much federal control should be exercised over a private project, specifically whether a full NEPA review is required when the federal agencies control only a small segment in an otherwise private project. Courts have determined if an otherwise private project cannot proceed without federal permits, then federal agencies are required to satisfy NEPA requirements. Mr. Secretary, is it possible for a cross-border project to proceed without a presidential permit under current law now?
I really had better check that with my general counsel. I would have thought not, but I'm.
Well, my concern is that we've been trying to set a standard in this bill in previous legislation on cross-border electric transmission, natural gas pipelines, and of course crude oil pipelines. And in this case, Department of Energy would have the authority over electric transmission
wires,
and whether Department of Energy would use the NEPA process to approve those cross-border.
Yeah, well, again, my assumption is that, again, the two principles are there. The environmental impact, which is the NEPA process, certainly for the part in the United States, and the determination of public interest. Those are the two requirements and the two principles that I would uphold.
Well, I'm out of time, but I appreciate, I don't know DOE, if we pass this bill with this particular section in it, would have that authority. And I just wanted to see what the regulatory process would be with DOE.
Okay. I'd be happy to discuss that.
The gentleman's time has expired, but are you saying that under 3104, our legislation would not require a NEPA review?
It does require a NEPA review.
Oh, okay.
And that's what I was wondering. Because there's been some confusion on our legislation that we've done separately that NEPA review is not required.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure folks understand that it's in this bill.
It is.
It was in the previous bill we passed out of the House last session.
Right.
And on cross-border issues, not just for DOE.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman,
you
for clarifying.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome. Your department really was developed and instituted based upon our nuclear heritage, as you know, and also is focused on our nuclear future, and then you have to deal with a lot of the legacy issues. It's not really part of the hearing, but the introduction is just to let you know I appreciate the support I received from your professionals down at Savannah River, which I visited yesterday, and the contractors there, and they took good care of me. Great. And I just want to put that on the record. Now to the QER. The QER devotes an entire chapter to improving North American energy integration, but makes no mention of issues belying cross-border presidential permitting in general, or the Keystone XL pipeline in particular. It's kind of some of the questions I think Mr. Green was alluding to. Do you agree that the, and I quote, ad hoc or siloed permitting process, close quotation, as the QER puts it, creates significant uncertainty?
Yes, it certainly can in many cases. Mm-hmm.
Has the inability to render a decision on Keystone Pipeline impacted other energy projects in Canada? Do you know?
I'm not aware of it, but. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And can you check back with us? Obviously, there might be. Otherwise, I wouldn't be asking this question.
Well, only in the sense that obviously I have seen discussions about other pipelines to take out things east or west, for example. But
right. I think the public and as a whole, I don't think they really. Sometimes I put up the transmission system on a map just to identify how many cross-border pipelines and transmission lines we already have, both north and south.
I think it's like 74 pipelines or something.
Right, and obviously it's curious. We have problems with one, and the debate is, will we have problems with the future, or is this uncertainty kind of slow down the process? And so part of the legislation, which the chairman is pointing to, talks about this cross-border energy infrastructure language in the committee's energy diplomacy discussion draft. Would it attempt to address unnecessary delays in the permitting of cross-border pipelines and transmission lines? Have you looked at this, and is there room for improvement when we're talking about pipelines or wires?
Well, obviously, as was already stated, the pipelines, as you know, are not in our jurisdiction. The wires are, and I think it's going pretty straightforwardly. I might add that just the projects discussed over the last 5 years for new transmission lines would total about 5 gigawatts of additional capacity coming into the Northeast.
Yeah, and we had a hearing just a week ago, I think, on the really the desert, really the natural gas desert of the New England states. We had the governor of Maine here, which would address obviously pipeline infrastructure and probably cross-border also with them. I mean, I think a lot of people would kind of shake their head understanding that we still heat with fuel oil in some major states in our union, where access to natural gas pipelines might help them transition, especially with the abundance that we seem to be having now with our production.
If I may just,
you may.
That about a week and a half ago, we did approve for potential FTA re-export a project to Canada, a natural gas project to Canada.
The energy diplomacy discussion draft also talks about improving the process for permitting major energy projects. Do you agree that it would bring greater clarity and predictability to the process and help in this energy diplomacy part?
Could you clarify if we did what exactly?
Well, the formulation of coordinated procedures and criteria balance energy security impacts with environmental considerations. So you've got to, especially in energy diplomacy, Shimkus is ethnically Lithuanian. A lot of people here have heard that before. I've toured the LNG terminal. This energy diplomacy for our friends around the world, whether it's Japan or whether it's the Eastern European countries, is really critical to give them choices of energy. And so the question is cost-benefit analysis and how can you expedite it, and I think your quadrennial review addresses this a little bit.
Well, again, as I said earlier, the whole issue of energy security is we are looking at in a broader sense than the traditional way. And by the way, maybe not here, but if you'd like, we'd be happy to come to your office and discuss the work on Ukraine specifically, since that seems to be an interest potentially.
That'll be a great interest to many members.
We'd be happy to do that.
Thank you.
But we are trying to expedite these issues.
This time, the chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on the transmission, storage, and distribution beyond what you've already testified to, because America's energy infrastructure is aging. It is not well matched with the new sources of supply. It is exposed to increasingly dangerous extreme weather events associated with climate change, such as sea level rise. In my neck of the woods, we're concerned about more intense electrical storms, and then drought and wildfires. And I know you're sensitive to the potential for cyber and physical attacks as well. And part of America's policy right now is to encourage these new clean energy supplies and greater energy efficiency, such as the availability of rooftop solar that holds great promise for powering households and businesses across the country, and our growing energy efficiency sector that will rely on smart meters, a smart grid, distributed generation. But these run completely counter to the traditional electric utility model. Now, you've testified already today about, well, energy assurance grants for states. Maybe you need to go into greater detail on the microgrids. I've never heard of a synchro phaser. What else really must we be looking for to modernize America's grid and infrastructure going forward?
Well, in terms of the grid, including both the transmission and distribution systems, I think one major theme is that we need to really push forward on what we've just barely started, and that is real integration of information technology into the grid and all of the associated requirements to take the data to be analyzed, of course. The synchro phasers are part of that. We could discuss that some other time. But sensors, control systems, coupling information technology into distributed decision making, so that the grid can respond quickly if there's something developing on the reliability side, for example. So that really is, I would say, the overarching theme, more and more information technology integration into that system. That does, of course, potentially exacerbate another thing you mentioned, which is the cyber risk that we have to stay ahead of. And I would say there, I just might add that under the leadership of our Deputy Secretary, we head something called the Energy Sector Coordinating Council, which has EEI and a number of CEOs that meet 3 times a year to discuss these kinds of risks to the infrastructure, to the grids especially. On the grid, there are some other issues besides those I mentioned, such as the role of potentially DC, long-distance DC transmission, where that's much more prevalent in other parts of the world right now. But again, IT, I would say, number one in terms of where we have to go.
And back on your energy assurance grants, would they be open only to states, or would local communities and businesses be able to tap into
I think
those grants?
there's still really a lot of program design to do, and we'd be happy to talk with the members about that. I think the way we've been envisioning it is principally through the states, but hoping that the states, to be competitive, would be working with localities and tribes in the appropriate states, for example. But that's all a detailed program design.
I'd hope you'd open it up to local collaboratives or regional collaboratives. Sometimes you have recalcitrant states, even there's an unwritten state policy in Florida right now. You can't even say climate change, so that doesn't bode well for our ability to compete for those grants. And
Okay, we'll take that under consideration.
Great.
Because it's been raised before in terms of cities wanting to be able to be direct applicants.
Absolutely. There's been some discussion today about experts of oil and gas. How much, you've used a number today, how much right now is America importing of petroleum and gas?
I think we're still importing close to 7 million barrels a day of crude oil.
Okay.
Although we are net exporters of about 2.5 million barrels of oil products. So our net imports are maybe 4.5 million barrels.
Doesn't the export heavy focus run counter to America's policy imperative to reduce carbon pollution?
Well, as I said, frankly, I think in our current situation where we are still major importers, relaxation of export is probably likely to more or less just swap around different oil qualities in different places, as opposed to lead to tremendously increased production or demand. That's my view.
So you do not think that exporting additional carbon fuels would exacerbate the problem of carbon pollution across?
I think the key is that even as we are producing more, and this debate is going on in terms of exports, I think the important thing is, and we satisfy this, is keep your eye on the ball for reducing oil dependence, and that means we are aggressive on efficient vehicles. We are aggressive in terms of developing low-carbon fuel alternatives like next-generation biofuels, and we are aggressive in supporting the move towards electrification of vehicles with clean electricity supplying those vehicles.
So, ladies, time. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say. So, if you look at it, we are, I think, succeeding. For example, in the last, I think it's some number of years, maybe a decade. Even as our population has increased, as our GDP has increased 13%, we have actually decreased petroleum fuel use.
Gentlelady's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming today. The Chairman Upton mentioned his interest in Ukraine and the meetings over there with the Ukrainian Parliament, the EU, getting resources over there. You said something that you're doing a lot with Ukraine. Would you care to elaborate, please?
I'd be pleased to. Starting in middle of 2014, the G7 energy ministers, together with the EU, met to discuss energy security issues, and that included specifically the Russia-Ukraine situation. Out of that came a commitment to work with Ukraine for that winter, and so DOE led a team of several U.S. agencies plus Canadian experts that went to Ukraine several times and guided them to a winter contingency plan for energy. So that occurred, including, by the way, a tabletop exercise at the level of the Deputy Prime Minister. Then we are back there helping them again, look forward to next winter, but other things as well. For example, we pointed out the dependence not only on natural gas, but on Russian nuclear fuel. And you may have seen now that's led to Westinghouse now has a contract to be a fuel supplier for the Russian reactors in Ukraine. This has caught the attention of some, breaking a monopoly again. So we are working in a number of ways to help Ukraine on the energy situation.
Thank you. The Department of Energy has made progress on a few LNG export applications, but the fact of the matter is that more than 30 applications still await final decision from DOE. And I realize that you decided to reconfigure the process to allow FERC to go first with its environmental review, but the process as a whole remains complicated, unpredictable, especially for U.S. allies who are unfamiliar with the bureaucratic process between DOE and FERC. My question is, when will DOE finalize its follow-on economic study of exports in the 12 to 20 billion cubic feet per day range?
I can't give you an exact date, but I expect it quite soon. So, I mean, I don't think it's going to be an impediment because today we are at 8.5, I think, BCF per day, approved for non-FTA countries.
Would the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership clear the way for automatic LNG export approvals?
I think that will depend on the specifics of how it's negotiated, but it may very well provide FTA status to more countries, in which case the approval is more or less automatic. Although I would caution, because this statement is also often raised with regard to TTIP and Europe, that the reality is that the market prices probably have a bigger impact than whether you are labeled FTA or non-FTA.
Do you support the provisions within the discussion draft which would effectively give DOE 60 days to act on an application following the FERC environmental review?
Well, we've made our statements very clear on that, in particular in a hearing in the Senate, that we frankly find it unnecessary. We've been acting quite quickly. It's workable. We've said it's workable. We can work with it, but we don't think it's necessary.
U.S. Oil production has risen rapidly in the last several years, and imports are falling. In fact, only about 1/4 of the petroleum consumed in the U.S. is imported from foreign countries, which is the lowest level in 30 years. When asked about lifting the ban on oil exports, you've made the point that the U.S. still imports oil, which is a fact. But given our role in the global market, would it make sense to both import and export oil?
Well, again, we need. I mean, I imagine we're going to meet our needs, and so if we export a barrel, we're going to import a barrel to replace it. So, as I said earlier, the only real issue in terms of the exports is whether that would lead to any material increase of production, as opposed to just in effect swapping oil. There could be some issues there in terms of oil quality. For example, the Mexicans have specifically petitioned for a swap in which we would send light oil to Mexico in return for heavier oil coming back. That's an example of a swap. But I have to say, it is not as though we have not been able to absorb all of the oil production today in the United States. It's been, so anyway.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony. The discussion of our nation's energy infrastructure is very important, and as is the administration's work on the quadrennial energy review. I'm particularly interested in the pipeline safety aspect of it. Over my years on this committee, I have referenced very many times the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969. That oil spill had tremendous local and national ramifications, giving birth to our modern environmental movement in many ways and changing much of the way our nation as a whole has viewed the environment and oil development. Sadly, the Santa Barbara community was recently hit with another terrible oil spill along the coast. On May 19th, more than 100,000 gallons of crude oil spilled from the ruptured Plains All-American pipeline along the treasured Gaviota coast, just north of Santa Barbara. The oil quickly flowed under the highway, onto the beach, and into the ocean, where the oil slick spread south for miles along the coastline. While the exact causes of the spill are still being investigated, it is already clear that woefully inadequate federal pipeline safety standards have played a significant role. It turns out that the Plains All-American Pipeline is the only federally regulated pipeline in Santa Barbara County. It's also the only transmission pipeline in the county that does not have an automatic shutoff valve built into its system. And this is not a coincidence. Every other comparable oil pipeline in Santa Barbara County has an automatic shutoff valve because the county has required it. But the Federal Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, as it's called, does not make this requirement of pipeline operators. While an automatic shutoff valve may not have prevented the spill, it certainly could have minimized it. Plains was actually allowed to squirrel away tens of millions of dollars into what they called a contingency fund for when their pipeline would inevitably fail. Yet they weren't even required to spend a fraction of that amount on installing basic spill prevention technologies. This, to me, defies common sense, and it cannot be allowed to continue. And this is just one example of lax safety standards. My constituents are understandably angry, and I share their anger. With all due respect for my seatmate, Mr. Green, who appropriately isn't here right now, oil and gas development at its core is dangerous and dirty business. The mere fact that Plains and other companies have oil spill contingency funds shows that there is no such thing as a safe pipeline. Spills do happen, and they will continue to happen as long as we depend on fossil fuel for our energy needs. We obviously cannot end this dependence overnight, but we clearly need to take bigger and bolder actions to achieve the clean energy future that we all know is needed. Secretary Moniz, I appreciate the President's and your strong commitment to pursuing renewable energy. The objectives of QER are important. We cannot build a clean energy future without modernizing our infrastructure and preparing for new challenges, but we must also do everything in our power to ensure that this infrastructure is as safe as possible. Congress has repeatedly directed PHMSA to strengthen its standards, and yet PHMSA has done very little. The QER specifically mentions a draft PHMSA rule in development that would help strengthen some of these standards. But PHMSA first began taking comment on this rule nearly 5 years ago, and nothing has been published so far. And in 2011, Congress enacted legislation explicitly directing PHMSA to issue a rule requiring automatic shutoff valves on new pipelines by January of last year. Still, not even a proposal, let alone a final rule. I find this really inexcusable. I know DOE does not have direct control over this agency. Transportation does, or rulemaking. But what's the point of replacing aging pipelines and building new ones if they're all built using ineffective and outdated safety standards? The pipeline that burst in my district was not even 30 years old. So age is clearly not the only factor here. So, Mr. Secretary, my question for you, and I'd appreciate if you can get back to me because I've taken most of this time, but what is the administration going to do now to ensure, there's a lot of attention focused on this topic, to ensure that a new pipeline infrastructure is as safe as possible?
Well, again, as you said, PHMSA obviously is in the Department of Transportation, and I'm certainly happy to talk with Secretary Fox and get back to you. But obviously the QER focus is we've got to rebuild infrastructure in a way that is reliable and resilient, and I would say this is an example of resilience by having the kinds of safety systems in place that maybe cannot avoid but can dramatically limit the impacts. So this is just part of why we need this discussion, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, welcome back to committee. It's always good to have you here. If I could just follow up what the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, was asking, and you mentioned about the swap for light versus heavy with Mexico. Maybe some folks might not understand why you'd have to have a swap. Why is that? That you'd have to swap light for heavy crude?
I just mentioned that that's what the Mexicans have petitioned for, because I think currently we do not have authorities for exporting oil directly to Mexico. So they recommend. So my understanding is it isn't a DOE, of course, but my understanding is they asked for this kind of idea of a swap, which is under consideration, I believe, at Department of Commerce, I believe.
Okay, thanks very much. Another issue not only has this subcommittee taken up, but also especially the telecom subcommittee in regards to cyber attacks and physical attacks that could occur to our infrastructure in this country. And so it's really not only a growing concern, but a great concern that we all have as to what could happen. The committee's discussion draft on energy reliability and security provides the Secretary of Energy the authority to take emergency measures to protect the bulk power system from grid security emergencies. Are you generally supportive of the DOE having grid security emergency authority?
Well, I believe we have that. We have the authorities, but only under emergency conditions.
Well, let me ask, what other grid security recommendations you make to this committee that we should consider at this time?
Well, I don't know what is appropriate for statutory direction, but I think the utilities, for example, on physical security, many of them have taken significant steps since the California incident. They're not always advertised for obvious reasons, but they have been doing that. Similarly, by the way, many of the utilities, but the reason we need to really complete a study on the transformer issues, whether it's because of a physical attack or just, wear and tear, a number of utilities have really moved in terms of their backup there, but it's not uniform. And, of course, we have very, very different utility structures, organizational structures. So it's very different for IOUs versus co-ops, et cetera. So I think there is some, that's an example where maybe after a study, some statutory action could be called for in terms of how do we provide appropriate resilience to the low probability but very high consequence of not having access to big transformers.
Let me ask this: how concerned are you about electromagnetic pulses against the grid system?
Well, that's another risk that we identified. There are studies on that. National Academy has studied that. I would say it's once again an example of a probably low probability but significant consequence possibility.
When you say low probability, what percent probability would you put?
I'm not going to give a number, but just say it's low.
Okay. Well,
but again, there has been hardening done by many to key transformers, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. Could you explain the importance of information sharing and public-private partnerships as it relates to securing the electric grid?
I'm sorry,
could you explain the importance of information sharing and public-private partnerships as it relates to securing the electric grid?
Oh, I think that's very important. Once again, the Energy Sector Coordinating Council that our Deputy Secretary heads is part of that public-private partnership. And by the way, I have to say, groups like EEI have been just excellent partners in that. And in terms of information sharing, just one particular example, there's a lot of information sharing in terms of reliable operations, et cetera. But one area I would highlight that this council does is, including through providing selective security clearances, sharing cyber threat data with the private sector.
Okay, and finally, the very short period of time I have, in analyzing recent power plant retirements, the QER mentions market factors, low cost of natural gas, and changing coal prices are driving factors behind the retirements. Would you agree that environmental regulations like the mercury air toxic standard and the proposed clean air power plan also played a role in the retirement of some of our electric generating units?
Well, certainly things like mercury restrictions obviously raise costs, and that's always the cost calculation. But again, I think by far the dominant issue over these last years has been gas prices of $2.50, and for certainly inefficient coal plants, even the variable cost is beat by by natural gas combined cycle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired. I yield back.
This time, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one comment and 4 questions, so I'll go lickety-split, and I think I'll ask them all 4 so you can answer them. The comment, you've been getting praise for being a great Secretary of Energy and sideline as a nuclear negotiator, but I don't think people know that you do the best imitation of Louis Tiant is wind-up delivery in pitch, and I think all members should ask for a demonstration.
Including the look to God.
The look to God. That's right. The whole thing. But the questions, one, this committee's been doing great work on energy efficiency, and energy efficiency in Vermont has been fully embraced, and it has led to our transmission company, Velco, being able to avoid about $400 million in expenses associated with transmission lines. So I want your comment on what we can do as a committee and the federal government can do to help get the benefits of avoided cost. Second, we've been trying to get real-time information on electricity rates in New England, in significant part because our rates are very high, and your department has been helpful trying to get real-time information in all the states in Canada and Mexico, but has been having real challenges in actually getting that information. And I'm curious to know what you find is the reasons why it's so tough to get that, and what the department and FERC can do to help reduce the electricity bills for New Englanders. Third, this is a smaller issue but quite important. We have some biomass stove manufacturers, and the standards evolve. One of those stoves companies is Hearthstone, and they're having a real hard time getting basically an answer on what the standards are so that they can comply. So we need some help on that. Yeah, that's right. So they have a great product, but if they don't get a real definition of what the standard is, then it makes it tough for them to stay out there in the market. And he's been having an awful hard time with that. Small company, but important company, and real jobs to Vermonters. And then finally, net metering. That's tough because you have to have net metering if you really want to deploy energy efficiency. On the other hand, it obviously has an impact on the economic model. Vermont has gone in a different direction than most states, led by Green Mountain Power, our biggest utility, to embrace and promote expansion in net metering. What could we do at the federal government to help that process that's going to help deploy energy efficiency, but also deal with the economic realities of many of our big power producers? Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Welch. So the 4 questions. Well, actually, the third question on the emission standards of biomass stoves, I think is something that we'll get back to you on because I just don't know the answer right now, but that's one we can take care of. On the energy efficiency in Vermont, well, again, and as you know, I was in Vermont with the delegation, and Vermont has done a fabulous job in terms of efficiency with novel business models for supplying energy. But I would say there the main thing, the recommendation in the QER of relevance to that, and to a certain extent to the net metering discussion as well, is that we need to develop, and at DOE we will start really delving into this much more. We need to devise a much better way of valuing all the services that can be provided in an electricity system. Efficiency, storage, diversity, capacity, power quality. There are all of these issues, and when we had the traditional business model, and it was basically one way from a central plant to a house, well, it kind of all got lumped together. But now, with much more diversity, with storage coming in some cases, distributed generation, we know that energy efficiency, this involves another hot issue right now that's in the courts, is to what extent does end-use efficiency come back all the way to the wholesale market, which FERC is engaged in. So I think this issue of valuing all the services is really core, and that's something that we want to, over the next months, really work hard on, and that's something that needs dialogue with the members. So that's, I think, an absolute critical recommendation. And in terms of electricity prices and real-time prices, I would just note that the EIA has, in fact, not so long ago launched a new product which has much more real-time data being collected from the ISOs and the RTOs and combined together, so that one can research it and one can understand how prices are moving. Yeah.
Gentleman's time's expired. This time I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you again for coming before us. In the last week, during the break, I returned to West Virginia and was on overload of negative information coming at us in West Virginia. The first newspaper I got when I got back there was Dark Day for Miners. They had just announced that 2,268 coal mining jobs were lost. 2,268 families now are looking for jobs as a result of this mining. Then soon thereafter, we got another power plant closed down, the Camera power plant. Even though FERC has said that, and they've testified before us, that the concern they have is that we're going to have rolling blackouts in the Midwest if we don't start replacing these power plants, but we're continuing to shut these power plants down. And then there was another one that went on to say just in one community, one small community, that they're going to lose $61 million in wages as a result of this. So I'm dealing with all of this crisis where when you add the additional losses, these 2,268, now we're up to, and I believe the chairman mentioned it earlier today, that we have now lost in West Virginia 45% of our coal miners are unemployed since 2012. Just in 3 years. 3 years, we've lost 45% of our coal miners are looking for work. Now, I went on last Friday, I met with the Coal Association, and I could see there, they said there's going to be further contraction as a result of what's policies and that are happening nationally. So they're very concerned about what's going on with it. This loss of the Camera and other power plants, it challenges, you well know, the grid stability that we have, this dependability. But it's not, it goes beyond that, you know that, and that is, what about the property taxes? What about the local income tax that people are going to pay? You can take away the power plant, but now you're affecting the schools. You're affecting how our community operates with this happening. So my first question of 2 questions would be, what would you suggest that would, to the coal industry, to reverse this decline?
Well, Mr. McKinley, first of all, of course, we all feel, for whatever reason, when there are these major disruptions in communities, it's obviously something that we need to pay attention to, and administration does have some programs to look at some retraining, particularly in the overlap areas with natural gas production, the Power Plus plan that's been put forward. But I recognize that these don't address 45% of a workforce, so they help in the right direction, but they certainly do not, quote unquote, solve the problem.
But keep in mind, too, Mr. Secretary, you know something, the coal miners, the average age is going to be in their 50s. What are we going to retrain them? So my second question, since I didn't, unfortunately, you don't have a quick answer either on this, as to how to stop the hemorrhaging. But the second question, so if you're sitting in the kitchen with this 55-year-old that just lost his job, he's been working 30 years in a coal mine, what do you tell him?
Well, look, again, I'm completely with you. This is very, very difficult. It's very difficult. I think in the end, it's about having to try to produce some other economic opportunities, revitalization, some retraining,
but these are real. You understand? These are real people that have really lost their job.
And the following is not on the right time scale for you. But I've said previously, I think in front of this committee as well, that we do have many programs, many different kinds of programs that are addressing the issue of a future of coal, even in a low-carbon world. But that's not going to solve that gentleman's problem tomorrow. I completely agree with that.
So in the 23, what are we telling him?
I think the key,
he's got to make he's got a mortgage payment. He's got a health care bill. He's got what are we doing for him?
The key has to be economic development and providing other opportunities. And I might just mention, Mr. McKinley, that I'm happy to say that here that also because recently Senator Manchin has asked me to come to West Virginia, and I'd be happy to join him and you and come to West Virginia and try to understand the situation and what we can do.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Yeah.
This time, recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Moniz. Thank you for your testimony today, and thank you for all your good work in so many things. We really appreciate it. I'd like to join everyone in applauding your efforts.
I have a hard time hearing you.
I'll do this. This is
Thank you.
better.
That's
okay. Generally, not so hard to hear New Yorkers talk. I'll just try to talk a little louder and not slur my words. I want to applaud your efforts and the efforts of everybody involved in producing the first report of the QER task force. I believe it really establishes a very sensible blueprint, making our electric grid more resilient and to identify and improve vulnerabilities in our current energy transmission distribution system. As you know, Superstorm Sandy swept through my district and the surrounding region in October 2012, knocking out power to over 8 million people and causing several fuel supply and distribution problems. Some New Yorkers in my district waited more than 2 weeks for their lights to turn back on and struggled the whole time to keep their families safe and warm. So as a result, I am particularly focused on the ability of our grid and our entire energy transmission and distribution system to withstand future shocks and also to recover quickly from any outage that might occur. So could you please discuss how we're better prepared today than we were in 2012 for a storm like Sandy, and how the suggestions in the QER would build upon the improvements we've made? In particular, please touch on the establishment of the Northeast Reserve and the potential expansion of distributed generation through the REV initiative in New York.
Thank you. Well, first on the regional gasoline reserve, as you know, that has been established with a million barrels, distributed in 3 locations from the New York Harbor area up to Portland, Maine, and that complement to the heating oil reserve that was established some years back. I might point out that one of the recommendations, by the way, which I would put in front of the committee, is that it would be very useful if the authorities for using those reserves could be harmonized, because they are quite different, and this would not help in terms of a coordinated response in terms of an issue. So that's successfully put in place. It is paid for as well for 4.5 years of operation, and I might add, we are currently now about a third of the way through to using the remainder of the money to repurchase 4.2 million barrels of crude oil to go back into the reserve, because we took out 5 million, so it'll be 4.2 crude, 1 million gasoline, and 4.5 years of operations of the reserve. Secondly, with regard to the grid and resiliency, again, I'd like to highlight what we consider to be one of the most important recommendations, and that is actually 2 recommendations. One is to support in our FY16 budget request state assurance grants to allow planning for hardening infrastructure, and then, and this is a case we have to find out, working with you, how to raise the revenue, how to raise the resources, but to establish several $1 billion for competitive resiliency projects. That could include things like microgrids, but designed for resiliency of the energy system.
Thank you. Let me ask one more question. The QER report also recommends ways to further integrate the energy infrastructures of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and the idea is to enhance market opportunities, energy security, and sustainability. Some transmission lines already send hydropower from Quebec to the Northeast United States, and the potential exists obviously for more capacity on more transmission lines in the region. Could you please talk about what role, if any, these transmission lines should play in our energy future?
I think these are very important. Of course, one that was approved recently was the Champlain-Hudson line that would take power to New York from hydropower. And there are a variety of projects for 4 to 5 gigawatts of additional hydropower that could be available to the Northeast and upper Midwest. This obviously would be clean energy and to meet our needs.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate that. Let me reference the comments made by Mr. McKinley of West Virginia. We've had hundreds of layoffs in my district alone. Of course, in my neighboring state of West Virginia and Kentucky, there have been thousands, and it has been devastating. You referenced natural gas in relationship to the closing of some of the coal-fired power plants as one of the factors. Of course, it is one of the factors. But the regulations coming in also. Yesterday, we closed down the Glen Lynn facility in my district. It was paid for by the ratepayers. Wouldn't cost them any additional. It was only being used at this point for the peak periods. That's now gone. The Clinch River facility in my district had 3 EGUs, 3 electric generation power plants. They are converting 2 of the 3 over to natural gas. However, the third one is not going to be converted, and the 2/3 that used to be there will produce about half of the electricity. I'm just concerned that in the peak periods of use, now that they're gone, how are they going to be replaced in Southwest Virginia and in other parts of the AEP footprint?
Well, of course, I don't know well enough the exact geography and the distribution of power plants. Clearly, if I talk more broadly, one of the issues clearly is the continuing build-out of the transmission system to move power around effectively. And I might say that I was a little bit surprised, frankly, with the data that came out in the QER that the spending on transmission in the country has actually reached $14–15 billion per year, with a continuous increase basically over the last 10 to 15 years. So we actually don't think that like any significant increase in resources will be required. The issue will be to make sure that the lines are configured, of course, to make sure that energy gets to all the various places.
And I get that, and that brings up natural gas pipelines in talking about all of this, and they're building them in my district with great opposition from many people who don't like the pipeline concept. They're also building them in a district just north of mine. Pipelines are going everywhere. But I noticed in the QER, you note the need for pipeline replacements for existing pipelines, and that you suggest a DOE-run grant program designed to allow states to receive funds to aid in improvements to pipeline infrastructure. I support improving our current system for existing pipelines. I'm interested in learning more about the details. What new authorities do you all think you need at DOE, or do you want at DOE in order to create this program? And will you be providing language to the committee so that we can see about putting that into the appropriate bill? How do you envision the DOE replacement program working? How would the funding get to the existing states? Would it be the existing funding? Are you going to come up with new funding? Where's the money going to come from? What's the timeline, and how would the states apply, et cetera? I'll throw all those out at you once. I'll be glad to go back and review them, but I don't want my time to run out.
I think we'll have to get back to you with a lot of the detail, but let me make several points. First of all, on the resource issue, we were very clear that we do we had about $500 million proposed in the FY16 budget to address various QER recommendations. But there were another $15 billion of need identified, which we were very clear we have to have a discussion in terms of where can those resources come from. That's over many years, but still. So specifically, the funding for the acceleration of natural gas distribution infrastructure replacement is not in our budget. So that's one of those cases. And we have in the past, of course, had many examples of raising resources in various ways for major infrastructure projects. I think that's the discussion we need to have with the Congress. Are we prepared to find these mechanisms for a significant push on energy infrastructure?
And as we transition then, and we use more natural gas, then it would seem that at some point that funding is going to have to come forward, which means it's going to be passed on to the ratepayer, and yet another expense added on to one of their energy bills.
Right, and what we're seeing today, by the way, I have a, at least for these years, I have a place in D.C., and on my bill, there is a specific surcharge on there for replacement of the natural gas distribution pipe. What we are saying is we think this needs to be accelerated. I'll be clear. I guess it's Washington Gas, I don't know, whoever it is. The surcharge is for a 40-year replacement program. Well, that seems like an awfully long time. So what we're arguing is we need to shorten these. Utilities are typically doing this many, many decades to keep the rate hit low. We're saying, geez, we need to accelerate this, and what we are proposing is funding that would go to help low-income households absorb the rate hit.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here with us again today. At the risk of piling on, I want to associate myself also with the concerns already mentioned regarding the coal industry. My district is a district and a state heavily dependent upon the coal industry, not only for reliable energy, affordable energy, but also the jobs that it represents. I was on a trip to Europe just a couple of weeks ago, and one of the statements that one of our European colleagues in the energy sector made was that, over the last 20 years or so, they have led America in shutting down much of their coal industry in an effort to reduce their carbon emissions. But some of those European countries, when we ask them what their energy profile looked like, they're returning to a higher percentage of a use of coal. And when I questioned them about that, I said, why is that the case, and how do you think you're going to be able to reach this 40% reduction by 2030? And this official said, look, we've learned, our ratepayers, our businesses and our residential customers have said they are no longer willing to pay the exorbitant high prices for energy. The idea is you make coal so expensive by taxing the carbon emissions that renewables and other alternative forms of energy are more economically attractive. They're going back to coal. I don't know why America, Mr. Secretary, why we have to learn this lesson the hard way, that coal still provides the most reliable, affordable energy on the planet. And so let me get off of this subject because I have some others I want to talk to you about. You expressed a willingness to come to West Virginia with Senator Manchin and Representative McKinley. Can you swing through Ohio at the same time that you're in the region? And I'd love to take you to talk to some of our coal mining, coal operators, and some of the manufacturers who are being asked to idle their plants because there's not enough energy on the grid to meet the peak demand. And that's today. That doesn't even count for what's coming.
If I may make a suggestion that might be useful, we have a very, very excellent person named Dave Foster, who is really the creator of our Job Strategy Council. Perhaps a meeting with those of you with kind of Appalachian connections and coal, just to brainstorm around what might be other ways of going. I'd be happy to do that.
Can you help facilitate that?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
happy
Good.
to do that.
Well, my office will be in touch.
Certainly,
and we'll-
the two of you and Mr. McKinley would be among those.
Well, all right, we'd like to do that. Let me move quickly to these other questions. In March, William O'Keefe, the CEO of Marshall Institute, penned an editorial in the Washington Times where he notes that the Council of Economic Advisors annual economic report for 2015 details the beneficial effects for LNG exports that LNG exports would bring for domestic employment, geopolitical security, and energy industry, and the environment. He also makes the point that unless we act soon, we're going to lose many of these benefits. He says, while the American policymakers procrastinate, other countries are stepping up to meet these needs. The United States has an incentive not to wait. Our window of opportunity is closing. So with that in mind, what are your thoughts, not only on LNG exports, but are there any specific steps and policies we should be putting in place today to realize this opportunity before it's lost?
Well, I have to say, first of all, that we are not procrastinating. Again, we have approved, and by this is separate from the conditional approval that we made last week for the Alaska project, because that's a separate gas source. But for the lower 48, we've approved roughly 8.5 billion cubic feet per day to non-free trade agreement countries. We have no other applications to work on at the moment. And just to give a scale, I mean, the largest LNG exporter in the world is Qatar, and they are at about 10 billion cubic feet per day. Now, the first cargoes...
I hear you, Mr. Secretary. Then why does the rest of the world, why are they still urging America to get into the LNG export market on a global basis? Why does the rest of the world and the oil and gas industry think that we're not participating in the global export market?
I think that, first of all, there is a lot of misunderstanding, to be honest, number one. Number two, clearly, they're sitting there with $12, $15 gas, and they see us at $2.50, and they think that looks pretty good. Now, of course, by the time it reaches them, when you add $6 or $7 for the supply chain, it's not going to be our prices, but it still beats their prices. So clearly, they have an interest. They want to see that. Well, the fact is that if you look at the economic studies that have been done, not by DOE, by others, in terms of what they expect to be our real export market, very few of them come in above, say, 10 BCF per day, given competition in various parts of the world. So all I know is that's for the private sector to sort out. We have approved, we have studies that take us up to a potential 12 BCF per day. Earlier it was pointed out we've commissioned another study that would even look at 20 BCF per day. But in the meantime, we've approved 8.5. The projects are being built. The first cargoes will get on the water probably the beginning of 2016. And then we're going to start exporting. Another issue is, and a lot of our European friends say, they want the gas. I might just point out, as an aside, no value judgments. There are a lot of places in the world that don't want to develop their own indigenous resources, but would like ours. Okay, well, that's fine. But we do not direct where cargoes go. We approve export licenses to non-FTA countries, and those are commercial contracts. Frankly, it's a constitutional issue in terms of our not doing that.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I would submit to our committee and to the Secretary, there's a big disconnect somewhere, because the experts tell us that our price is going to rise when we get into the global export market. We haven't seen that. We've heard that the global market price is going to come down. We haven't seen that. So I don't know where the disconnect is, but there's a big disconnect somewhere.
Yeah. Thank you. This time I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, the discussion draft provides the Department of Energy with some new responsibilities beyond your current mission. For example, we direct the department to study the feasibility of establishing a federal strategic transformer reserve and arm the Department of Energy with new authority to address certain grid security emergencies, which I think is foremost in everyone's mind as far as grid security. Do you believe the Department of Energy has the expertise and capability to meet these new duties?
Well, yes, sir. First of all, on the transformer reserve, we are moving forward to study that. We have one study already from WAPA, our Western organization, but we're moving forward on that, and will, depending on the study, engage then in the appropriate public-private partnership to make sure that we are secure. With regard to grid security emergencies, again, we already do a lot of this. We work under the FEMA umbrella. We are the lead agency for energy infrastructure. So, for example, you may have read about the typhoon going through Guam a couple of weeks ago, I think it was. Well, we had a person in Guam as part of the FEMA response for energy infrastructure. So we are already doing this now. Additional authorities could be helpful.
Okay. In your testimony, you mentioned that one of the key energy objectives is enhancing energy reliability. What impact do you think that the proposed clean power plan will have on energy reliability and transmission issues?
Well, again, first of all, we analyze these issues, but of course we don't have a final rule yet to know how to analyze it. But what we have done to date and what we have done in terms of technical analysis around the proposal of last year, again, suggests that reliability will be quite manageable. But we have to wait to get the final rule before we can really do the.
So you don't think the proposed plan will have a big effect?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, one example of something that we did, there was an issue around the projected significant increase of natural gas for the power sector versus coal, and when we looked at the infrastructure issues of the gas delivery, we just did not find that there was likely to be any significant challenge. There would be some work to do, but not a significant challenge.
We, with Mr. Griffith from Virginia a while ago, you had a discussion about money to the states and things, and with this quadrennial energy review, recommends providing state financial assistance, which I think you all spoke about a few minutes ago, and grants and investment plans for electric reliability and efficiency. Can you discuss a little bit of some of the criteria, regardless of where the money's coming from, because we know there's a shortage of money, but can you discuss some of the criteria the Department of Energy will require for the states to receive this financial assistance, assuming, again, there would be money there?
Yeah, well, the money issue is relevant, and I must say I was very, very disappointed in the appropriations mark, which did not provide any funding for either the reliability or the assurance grants, which I think is short-sighted, to be perfectly honest, because I think the states need to have this kind of planning capability. We would provide technical assistance. Now, in terms of program design, that remains to be done, but what we envision will be ultimately proposals around things like microgrids, for example, for reliability and resilience. We would see, again, the integration of IT and smart grids as providing those services. And as I said, we hope in the reliability and assurance arenas to then have funding for competitive cost-shared grants.
Would the criteria be the same from state to state, or would it change across the country?
I think the criteria, well, they still remains to be worked out completely, but the criteria, would be around enhanced reliability and resilience. That's the criteria.
I understand that, but my question was whether it'd be the same from state to state across the country, or whether different states would face different criteria.
The same criteria, but the way the projects would be structured would look very different depending upon the regional and state resources.
Okay. I'm past my time, so if I had any time, I'd yield back. But thank you again for your testimony, Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman.
at this time I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, but I also just want to make a comment that I really appreciate your taking the leadership with the Republican Study Group on the forum on oil exports and having an opportunity to examine that more thoroughly today. So you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope Secretary Moniz will send someone to the discussion this afternoon. Of course, I want to talk about exports like my friend Mr. Barton did. One of the things you talked about is that one of the good reasons for the ability to have oil exports is because you have a better matching of the qualities of grades that are needed by the refineries in different geographical areas around the world. And you didn't go quite far enough, I don't think, because one of the things that happens when you have that better matching is you have economic efficiency, and economic efficiency releases additional capital, and that additional capital, based on my experience with 30 years in the business, would go back into reinvestment, which stimulates the production. So next time you're answering that question, if you go all the way through that economic cycle, I think that it would be helpful. The next thing has to do with, I guess I'd call it a safety valve question. As you know, there are multiple versions of or proposals for oil exports out there, and some of them include giving the President the authority, the ability to suspend oil exports in the situation where we had some sort of an energy crisis, or if it's deemed in the national interest, or to be able to use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve under those same circumstances. And so with those two safety valve features in place, doesn't that make it more compelling to allow oil exports?
Well, again, obviously more flexibilities are always welcome, but I think the fundamentals of the oil export question are those that we discussed earlier, I think, and I agree with you, of course, in terms of your economic argument.
Okay. One of the things that was interesting about timing is while your agency and others were working on the QER, the administration was also involved in negotiations with Iran. And in early April, your agency estimated that with a deal in place and the sanctions lifted, Iran might start selling us a stockpile of 30 million barrels or more later this year and raise its output by 700,000 barrels a day by the end of 2016. This would come at a time when we already have a global glut of crude oil. And so my first question is this: what analysis, if any, has DOE performed to better understand the implications of the entry of Iranian oil into the global markets on global supply and demand, global supply and prices, rather?
Well, I think, first of all, you stated the basic conclusion that one would see over some year or to 2 years certainly several 100,000 barrels per day, probably of increased production. That would go into the 95 million barrel per day or so pool. There are so many uncertainties in that timescale, in particular on the demand side. For example, a recovering European economy would put substantial then pressure on the supply side. Clearly, the nuclear negotiation is quite independent of that dynamic. That's about nuclear weapons issues that we think are important to block.
No, I do understand the independent nature of the two discussions. However, the impact is the same. So, I mean, the outcomes are the same.
Well, it's all supply and demand, and, you know.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly. And so I guess under these circumstances, doesn't it seem like the President would have an increasingly difficult time justifying lifting the sanctions on Iranian oil at the same time keeping the sanctions on domestic oil in place, where domestic oil can't be sold abroad?
Well, I think the big difference is that we import 7 million barrels a day of crude oil. We are not a net exporter. We are an importer.
Right, but we're on track to be in a position to export, so it makes sense to lift the sanctions.
That's quite a few years away. I mean, we're still, even if you add in oil products, we're still at 4.5 million barrels a day.
Okay. So. No additional questions. Thank you. I yield back.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, thank you for being with us again today. I believe this is the second time you've been in front of this panel.
More than that.
Well, I mean, but this year, if I'm not mistaken. At least this is the second time you and I had the opportunity to visit. And the last time we spoke, we talked about the lack of infrastructure with the power plants as far as the coal-fired plants that are coming down. We have a report from Southwest Power Pool that there's going to be 12,900 megawatts lost just in their area. And just a while ago, when you were being questioned, I believe, by Mr. Long, you said that you didn't see any significant challenges to meet those needs. But yet, where is the power going to come from? If we're going to lose 12,000 just in my region, then where's the extra power going to be made? Where's it going to be produced? The gas lines aren't there. We are seeing 4 years to take a permit, to just simply get a permit to install a gas line, unless there's power plants that are being built that I'm not aware of in my region. Then I believe there is going to be a significant challenge to meet the power needs.
Well, but first of all, let me emphasize that I did state that what we have seen to date, but we of course await a final rule. Secondly, of course, demand. Now I'm talking nationally, not in any particular specific region.
Well, but they're specifically speaking, the coal-fired plants are in a specific region.
No, sure. Well, every plant.
And so I understand that, but we have 12,900 megawatts being lost in one region. And you said that you didn't see any significant challenges of meeting those needs. Where is that extra power going to come from?
First of all, I made it very clear that the same when I discussed the natural gas transmission pipes, there will be local issues that have to be resolved in some places with new infrastructure. But if you look again, all I can do is look at the broad picture nationally and note that, first of all, electricity demand nationally is not going up. It's essentially flat. We are building significant amount of natural gas and wind, in particular, capacity.
So it's okay because the numbers aren't going up.
By the way, has plenty of wind.
yeah, but it's okay to bring the power down because we don't need it right now. I mean, that's like saying...
I did not say that. All I said was that we are building substantial capacity even as our demand is flat. And secondly,
where's the building? We're losing
power.
You're saying we're building significant capacity. What are we building it in? Because power cannot replace, or wind cannot replace what we have here. You can have miles and miles and miles of wind farms, which we have in Oklahoma, which I frankly don't think is very pretty. I think it leaves a lot bigger footprint than we do in anything else, but that's another topic. But we're losing 12,900 megawatts in one area. I'm going back to what you said with the gentleman from Missouri,
yes,
when you said you don't see significant challenges meeting those needs. So what I think I hear you saying, now correct me if I'm wrong, that it's okay that we lose it because our increase for electricity isn't the need isn't there, so it's okay that we lose it. Is that what I'm understanding?
No, that's what I'm saying is that first of all, we have about 68,000 megawatts of wind. But what I'm saying is that there will obviously all the local planning authorities will have to be planning, but at the macro level, we are not seeing the likelihood of enormous challenges. We are being cautious. We have to wait for the final rule to come into place.
But you guys are already moving forward with it, and Mr. Secretary, you're over the Department of Energy, and you're saying that the local communities, local areas need to get together. What is DOE's specific plan to meet this need? Is there not a need? It's just saying we're going to let them go down and let everybody else figure it out. It's not our problem.
Well, look, first of all, in our system, we don't. I mean, the private sector obviously builds power plants.
But you guys are the ones that pick winners and losers.
No.
Yeah, it is because you said coal's going out. Wind is the new thing.
Obviously, there's a responsibility of government, whether statutory or regulatory, to set certain rules of the road. in terms of environmental protection, et cetera, et cetera. The private sector and typically state regulatory bodies then respond to that. So
if I'm
that's
hearing
the
it
way
correctly,
works.
there is no plan. We're just going to drop the power and let everybody else figure it out.
There
Gentleman's time is
no
expired.
more
I'll
or
yield back.
no less
Thank you.
plan than there always has been.
Mr. Pompeo of Kansas is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your patience today. You've been with us a long time. We're getting towards the end, and so a lot of the questions have been asked, and so maybe I'll open the aperture just a little bit. Starting with this, do you believe that the American taxpayer has received good value for the tens of billions of dollars that have been spent on carbon capture technologies, federal dollars, that have been spent on carbon capture technologies to date? Yes or no?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's tens of billions of dollars, so it's quite a bit less than that.
Okay, whatever the number
But
is, do you think we've gotten good value
yeah,
for that?
But I think the answer is that, yes, it will prove to have been very, very well spent.
Thank you. I think they look more like cylinder than success, so we disagree. Yes or no, do you agree with the French foreign minister who has said that the global climate change agreement that is being negotiated this year should be worded in a way that does not require congressional approval? Yes or no?
I'm not aware of that statement.
So do you think, I'll ask it more directly.
If I may say, currently, obviously, the climate action plan that we are executing is based upon administrative authorities. To get a economy-wide approach eventually would require legislation.
The government that you're a part of is negotiating an agreement this year at the end of the year. It intends to enter into an agreement. They've made that very clear. Do you believe that the agreement that the United States enters into ought to be submitted for congressional approval?
I think we need to see what the nature of this agreement is. There are many agreements.
So I can't get you to say yes, that you think a climate agreement should be approved by Congress.
I think it very much depends upon what the nature of the agreement is.
I'll take that as a no. Today we've had a lot of questions about crude exports. It seems to me that the only country that you are currently advocating to export crude oil is Iran. Is that right?
Excuse me?
Right. You're sitting in a set of negotiations where we're going to free up the Iranians to export their crude products, but you won't advocate for Americans to be able to export their crude products. Is that?
As I said earlier, the situations are completely different, and we are a large importer.
The situations are identical. It would benefit each country greatly to be able to access foreign markets and sell their products at market prices around the globe, and both consumers and exporters would benefit from those in both countries if they are opened up. Do you agree with that or disagree?
Obviously, for Iran,
it's a simple question,
obviously,
Mr. Secretary.
Iran
Not a trick question.
Has sanctions lifted, it helps their economy.
And if we lifted ours, it would help ours too.
On the nuclear weapons side, as I said earlier, the only issue on oil exports in the United States of large-scale relevance is whether or not there is a significant increase in production as a result. And I've said, in the current oil market, that may be a difficult case to make.
Right. You don't believe in supply and demand when it comes to crude exports. You think no more supply will be lodged. So we've been through that. In 18 months, there'll be a new president, although maybe not a new Secretary of Energy. One never knows. Your QER was prepared based on this president's vision of greenhouse gases, their impact around the world, and America's role in diminishing them. If the next president comes in and has a different view with respect to that, tell me what remains of the value of the QER work that you all did.
Essentially all of it. The QER is really aimed clearly at facilitating more clean energy, but it's about energy security, resilience of our infrastructure. It's about energy, North American energy. It's got huge implications for our energy infrastructure, independent of the climate issues.
Yeah, I just have a different view of what's in that QER. When I stare at it, I see the analysis, and I appreciate that. I agree with your analysis of the requirements for increased infrastructure. We don't disagree there. But it seems to me most of what's in the QER was aimed at federal intervention in the marketplace. You have several references to classic market failure with respect to public goods and negative externalities. I think much of the conclusions in the QER about how that infrastructure will be ultimately built out and who will decide which infrastructure will be built out, is heavily dependent on this president's vision for climate change and how the United States can impact that. And I just think it was a wonderful exercise. I'm glad we did the work with respect to infrastructure, but I think the conclusions drawn in the QER will need to be revisited immediately by the next administration. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back, and that concludes our questions. We have one additional member, though, Mr. Kramer of North Dakota, who's a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. He's not on this particular subcommittee, but he's been so focused on these issues that he sat here for 2.5 hours with us, and we're going to give him the opportunity to ask 5 minutes of questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to my colleagues for the indulgence. You know, it does only take one good North Dakotan to represent the entire state, so I spread myself fairly thin, Mr. Secretary. So I thank the members, and I also, Mr. Secretary, want to thank you not only for being here, but for at least agreeing to, if not joyfully, although I think you're a joyful person, to holding one of the listening sessions in North Dakota. I know it was a late request and it was a late addition to the agenda for you and Secretary Fox and others, but I thoroughly enjoyed the time that you were out there. And I notice in the QER there's a lot of reference to things that you learned last August in North Dakota, especially as it pertains to the transportation infrastructure. And some of the challenges particularly reflected are the challenges for the railroads that move multiple commodities, as you know. And you heard quite clearly, and I think, again, indicated in the report quite clearly, that there were challenges. But at the same time, I think one of the things I want to do, I think, is sort of bring the record up to date a little bit. Last August, we were following on 2 record winters and 2 bumper crops, two seasons in a row that strained the infrastructure for sure for agricultural commodities. I think one of the bigger challenges was the fact that not only was it a record crop or a bumper crop, but it was a late harvest. It was due to weather. It was also a late and a very wet harvest. And so there was a consolidation of all of those commodities and the additional moisture creating other transportation problems like the movement of propane, for example, for grain drying. That perfect storm created incredible stress on the infrastructure. And along with, of course, 700,000 or so barrels per day of oil being moved by rail. So there's a fair bit of, there was a lot of criticism last August. There's a fair bit of that reflected in the report. But just in the last 10 months, the storm has sort of shifted, I think. And I want to stress some of those points, but also encourage you and the team to continue to monitor it on a very regular basis, because some of the things that were identified have worked. I mean, the STB's weekly, the requirement for the weekly reports, for example, by the Class 1 railroads has been very helpful in transparency, allowed better planning. A warmer winter with a more traditional harvest season and, frankly, lower commodity prices have created more normalcy. And during which time, and I can be the railroad's worst nightmare, but I also want to acknowledge when they have done their part. And I have to say, for BNSF, which is obviously our largest railroad by far, they have invested mightily in personnel, locomotive energy, cars, and certainly double tracking much of the Bakken region and much of the upper Midwest. And I want to be sure that the record is clear, but I also want to, again, encourage you to remain flexible and update the report regularly to acknowledge that this robust infrastructure does exist. And it's my hope and my expectation that additional and more robust rail infrastructure actually enhances all commodities. I also think it's worth noting that because of the STB reports, we've noticed that they are pretty well caught up, not just pretty well caught up, but caught up to the point where there's extra capacity. And much like the electrical grid, it doesn't hurt to have a little extra capacity, but it also creates opportunity for growth. So, I would only probably ask that, for you to comment on my comments if you'd like to, but again, express my appreciation for your attention to the issues.
Well, thank you. And we certainly appreciated, by the way, your participation in the QER field hearing in North Dakota, along with your Senate colleagues. First of all, I think you've put your finger on really what was the main driver of our discussion on this subject in the QER, and that was the need for more data. To be perfectly honest, the railroads have not always been the most transparent in terms of data availability, and I think that's certainly been improved. And certainly the issues around coal, for example, have been certainly relieved. There are other issues, as we know, in terms of oil by rail that are being addressed, and I might say that with the Department of Transportation, we have now launched the next phase of the study of relevance to crude properties and rail. It'll take about 18 months before we're ready with that. But anyway, but I think you're absolutely right. We've had some progress on the data front, and that allows. And EIA, by the way, is playing a role in there as well.
Yes, they are. Yes.
So it's great.
Well, thank you, and thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, and that concludes the first panel. Secretary Moniz, thank you very much for your testimony and answers to our questions, and we look forward to continuing to work with you on many pressing issues as we move forward, and thanks again for your leadership. And Mr. Rush will be notifying you the formation of the fan club, and we'll be getting together soon with that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr.
We'll have
Rush.
our first meeting relatively soon.
Okay. And there'll be a huge crowd there. So, I'd like to call up the second panel of witnesses at this time, and I want to thank them for their patience. I know many of them came from long distances. And is Joe Pitts going to introduce you? On our second panel today, we have Mr. Rudolf Dolzer, who flew all the way to the U.S. from Bonn, Germany to testify, and we appreciate him being here. We have Mr. Jason Grumet, who's the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center. And we have Mr. Gerald Kepps, who's vice president, Upstream Research and Consulting. We have Ms. Allison Cassidy, who's the director of the Domestic Energy Policy for the Center for American Progress. We have Ms. Emily Hammond, who's professor of law at George Washington University Law School. And I'm going to call on my colleague, Mr. Pitts of Pennsylvania, to introduce one of our witnesses as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Scott Martin, a county commissioner from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, formerly chairman of that commission and also active in the statewide association of county commissioners, an outstanding commissioner who I'm very pleased could travel down from Pennsylvania to be with us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and Mr. Martin, thank you for being with us. Once again, I want to thank all of you. We really look forward to your testimony, and I'm sorry that there was such a delay in your testifying. We had to reschedule a little bit, but Mr. Dolzer, I think you came the longest distance and from Bonn, Germany, and I think you were in the German Parliament at a time, and you're a professor also at the University of Bonn. And so we genuinely appreciate your making this effort, and I'm going to recognize you to start off with for 5 minutes, and then after everyone has concluded, we'll have some questions for some of you. So, Mr. Dolzer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the committee. My name is Rudolf Dolzer. I'm a German national who altogether has lived about 8 years in the United States. In Germany, I became a law professor. Subsequently, I was Director General of the Federal Office of the Chancellor under Chancellor Kohl. This is where my gray hair comes from. And then I was appointed 3 times to the German Parliament's Commission of Inquiry. We have that in Germany. You can be appointed to Parliament without the right to vote in the plenary. In the U.S., I studied in Spokane, Washington at Gonzaga University. Then I stayed for a longer period at the Harvard Law School. I later taught at 5 U.S. universities, the last time in Dallas in Texas. In Houston, I'm a member of the advisory board of the Association of Independent Petroleum Negotiators. A month ago, I published a larger study of international cooperation in global energy affairs. Mr. Chairman, the era of abundance, as you say, opens up new opportunities of leadership for the United States, and the world is looking at the United States. This reminds us also, at least me, that energy is not just about energy. It's about foreign affairs, it's about national security, it's about finances. But ultimately, energy has its own characteristics and dynamics, and this is my first major point. Foreign affairs, national security, and also issues such as trade must be folded into the fabrics of energy politics and not the other way around. This is also my view as regards climate change. Energy politics, Mr. Chairman, and when I look at your draft on energy diplomacy, energy politics also calls for arrangements of its own when it comes to international cooperation. Title III of your bill, the present bill, represents an innovative, modern approach, also from an international point of view. This title may even be strengthened by a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. Again, trade is not just one aspect of energy. Recent events, and this has been addressed this morning, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Europe in general, have underlined that energy independence will require safe energy supplies and will require political foresight and a robust long-term strategy. Together we must understand the nature of that issue. Europe, and this is not well known, Europe as a whole will in the coming decade become more vulnerable as our reserves dwindle, in particular in Norway. So this is Europe as a whole. The forums, as proposed in your bill, will serve to provide a common basis. But I propose that we go further and establish a more advanced concept which I call the transatlantic energy agenda. We need to update and broaden existing arrangements with the new involvement, I think, of parliaments and of the private sector. We have long-standing arrangements for cooperation in foreign affairs, in national security, in agriculture, for example. For energy, arrangements of this kind are lacking at the moment, and I think that ought to change. We need more exchange, we need better exchange, we need to know what we're doing, and we need exchange about best practice. America's abundance also lends itself to strengthening of regional partnerships. In Europe, we have particular experience in this respect. Since 2009, the European Union has the competence to deal with the establishment of a single market, but the member states have retained their sovereign powers to determine the energy mix. The French made sure that no one touches their right to work with atomic power. This is a very complex jurisdictional situation which we have in Europe. We now have a set of rules promoting competition in Europe with liberalization, with unbundling. We have less progress, and I think this is of interest here so far, with regard to internal and cross-border connections to overcome isolated domestic markets. The key concept which has been worked out in the last 24 months has been the idea of project of common interest, as it's called. The new rules call, and I think this is of interest here, for a much more rapid process of approving permits. So far, that time, don't be astonished, took about 10 years or more to have a permit for a transport arrangement. This is now going down to 3.5 years at a maximum, according to the new law. Also, member states now must introduce one-step authorities instead of the multitude of transparent institutional arrangements we have had so far. Now, the funds needed for a single energy market will be considerable, but I think the advantage will justify the costs. Costs in terms of secure supply, new infrastructure urgently needed, more options for the customers, more a better position, negotiating position on the international level. When you negotiate with Russia or the OPEC or Venezuela, I think the larger your market, the better it is. In North America, I think a new task force by the NAFTA countries, similar to the European Commission, might help to elaborate a unified energy strategy. Mr. Chairman, I conclude. In the past, energy issues have at times been a bone of contention between the United States and Europe, sometimes of bitter contention. I think your bill with Title III has the promise and the hallmarks of a new era of cooperation with tangible benefits on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you very much for your attention. I very much appreciate this opportunity to express my views before your important committee. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dozier. And our next witness, as I said, is Mr. Jason Grumet, who is the president of the Bipartisan Policy Center. And thank you very much for being with us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Whitfield, Mr. Rush, and the resilient members of the committee. On behalf of the Bipartisan Policy Center, it's a pleasure to join you in this important discussion on the economic and policy architecture governing our nation's energy abundance. My testimony can be summarized into 3 main points. First, I want to applaud the committee for focus on the significant opportunities to strengthen North American energy integration and collaboration. North American energy security and self-sufficiency are, in fact, realistic goals that must be vigorously pursued and not taken for granted. My second point, Mr. Chairman, is that increased North American cooperation is a critical component of a larger effort to promote economic growth through efficient markets, to enhance North America's role in global energy trade, and to project U.S. power and global interests. And my third point is that we must seize the opportunity to translate this strength of abundance into a long-term and sustainable energy strategy and not allow this strength to result in unintended complacency. In short, Mr. Chairman, this committee in Congress has the disorienting challenge of managing success, which is a new problem for our nation when it comes to energy policy, and I think it creates real opportunities that we need to discuss. So let me begin by saying a little bit about the energy integration and collaboration. I believe the provisions in this legislation that promote data quality and sharing, that coordinate planning and improve permitting and siting, are all essential to achieving the promise of North American energy security. The opportunities are particularly pronounced in the case of Mexico. While U.S. companies have much to gain in increased trade with Mexico, it is hard to overstate the importance of energy production to the Mexican economy and the broader U.S.-Mexican relationship. Even after years of decline, energy production remains a key source of high-paying jobs and is responsible for actually a third of Mexican government's overall activities. If modernization efforts succeed, energy production could be a significant driver of Mexican economic development and individual opportunity. And the implications here are quite broad. The Bipartisan Policy Center believes that we must reform our nation's broken immigration system. And while this hearing is not the place to discuss the challenges and intricacies of protecting the southern border or enhancing our legal immigration, there is no question that improved economic opportunity in Mexico is an essential component of successful and lasting immigration reform. Let me turn now to the issue of siting. While our technology for producing energy has evolved dramatically over the last decades, our permitting policies date back to the 1950s and 1960s and are poorly matched to our rapidly evolving needs. We commend the committee's substantive effort to make the cross-border permitting process more transparent and predictable. BPC also commends the committee's political judgment in crafting this provision to exempt the still pending Keystone decision. It is time to have a broad-based bipartisan energy debate that is explicitly beyond Keystone. And it is encouraging to see the committee working diligently to avoid a focus on symbolic disagreements in favor of producing an agenda that can secure broad bipartisan support and become law. I'd like to now move to the second point, which is a focus on the component that North America plays in the larger global picture. Our nation's made, I think, some very good progress of late supporting LNG exports. But as was discussed earlier, current restrictions on crude oil are undermining our commitment to efficient markets. They diminish our ability to promote free trade and fair trade, and they empower our adversaries who seek to use energy as a weapon. I cannot build upon Mr. Barton's string of studies except to agree that there have been a spate of recent analyses that all conclude that adding a reliable supply of crude to the global market will continue to exert downward pressure and actually protect U.S. consumers. My final point is on the challenge of how we use this abundance to promote our long-term sustainability and security needs. There is a broad critique of the abundance agenda that must be grappled with if we are going to secure the broad-based support for an effective national energy policy. The concern is that stable, low-cost supplies of oil and gas are undermining investment in the diverse array of technologies our nation and the world will require over the next century to meet global demand, to protect our security interests, and to confront the risks of climate change. This legitimate concern, however, leads to very different policy pathways. The Bipartisan Policy Center believes that additional action must be taken to confront climate change, but we reject the idea that we should pursue a low-carbon future by erecting and undermining barriers to the resurgence of oil and gas production. Perpetuating inefficient markets and creating transportation and infrastructure bottlenecks in the hope of somehow reducing global reliance on fossil fuels is not an effective climate change strategy, and if anything, it will result in increased emissions. Instead, as we vigorously pursue the benefits of abundance, we must be equally determined in conducting the research and creating the incentives to develop and commercialize the next generation of energy breakthroughs. From carbon capture and storage to utility-scale solar to next-generation biofuels, advanced nuclear, energy storage, and an array of energy-saving technologies, we must find ways to encourage greater investment despite the current low-price environment. America's hydrocarbon renaissance has given us the gift of time. The question before the committee and Congress is, what do we do with this time? In closing, the Bipartisan Policy Center looks forward to continuing to work with the committee as you build an architecture for abundance that grows our economy, enhances our security, and confronts domestic and global environmental threats. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next witness, who's already been introduced, but is Mr. Scott Martin, who's a county commissioner, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Thanks for being with us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the record, it's Lancaster, not Lancaster.
What did I say?
Lancaster, that's what you said, like Burt Lancaster.
Oh, okay.
That's an offense in Lancaster County. So,
well, I'm going to let
Mr. Pitts work with you on that one.
I'm going to let you and Mr. Pitts work that out.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
But thanks for letting me.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to be here. Again, I serve on the Lancaster County Board of Commissioners. The United States must work to develop a coherent, logical, and clear national energy strategy. I applaud Chairman Upton for his architecture of abundance legislative framework that will hopefully stimulate a wide-ranging and bipartisan debate on the need for a long-term national energy agenda based upon economic development, common sense regulations, a modern and safe energy infrastructure, greater efficiencies, increased exports, especially with LNG, to support our foreign policy goals, environmental sensitivity, minimal government involvement, and utilization of free market economic principles. There are certainly many positive developments and trends in energy. However, there are also numerous challenges and issues that urgently need to be addressed. The longer we wait to address and solve these issues will only make them more difficult, expensive, complicated, and controversial. One of the most pressing priorities is energy independence. Of course, energy independence can only be achieved if there are new and recoverable sources. The required infrastructure exists. The regulatory environment is not hostile. Capital is available to finance the expansion, and both domestic and international markets are functioning properly. Thankfully, due to horizontal hydraulic fracturing, known as fracking, and the discovery of vast new oil and gas reserves, America is now the world's largest oil and natural gas producer. As they should, energy prices have been decreasing. The United States is increasingly able to export large amounts of LNG around the world, and especially to European countries. The volatile and tense situation in Ukraine demonstrates very clearly why we need to build the Keystone XL pipeline, greatly accelerate the permitting of LNG export facilities, and work to expedite the building of pipelines and compressor stations. As noted above, a significant technological improvement has been the use of fracking and extracting natural gas from shale. The use of fracking in Pennsylvania and the construction of necessary infrastructure has had widespread and significant economic development impacts. Some of these include 96% of new energy hires were from the Appalachian area, 45,000 new building trade jobs in that same region, 243,000 new energy jobs in Pennsylvania, over $1 billion invested by the shale industry in road and infrastructure improvements, and including energy industry grants to community college and trade schools to train the workers needed by extraction companies in the Marcellus Shale region, with an average core wage of $68,000 a year. This increased shale gas production in Pennsylvania has also saved the average Pennsylvania family between $1,200 to $2,000 annually in energy savings costs. Businesses and other institutional energy users have also benefited from the greatly increased availability of cheap natural gas. The Pennsylvania National Guard and Army Reserve components at Fort Indiantown Gap, the Garden Spot Public School District, and the Shady Maple companies all in our area have experienced significant savings in their energy bills after switching to natural gas. Cheaper energy will further a developing industrial and manufacturing renaissance in America. In brief, lower energy costs create more disposable income and hence greater aggregate demand. Decreased transportation costs lead to lower prices, and American products are more globally competitive. The domestic oil and gas revolution can only be successful long-term if the necessary pipelines are quickly built and brought online. The Williams Company has proposed to build a 180-mile interstate pipeline known as the Atlantic Sunrise Project from northern Pennsylvania and connect it to their main U.S. gas pipeline that travels from Texas to the northeast. The actual connection point would be in southern Lancaster County. 37 miles of the proposed pipeline would go through my county, and we're talking about a $2.6 billion economic impact throughout the construction of this project. Williams has been very cooperative and easy to work with as various concerns have come up. Over 100 route changes, which is more than half of the original route, have been made based on stakeholder input. Williams is also committed to making the pipeline open access so that potential customers in Lancaster County could directly access the pipeline. As you can imagine, a project of this size does generate controversy and opposition. One early controversy was the proposed routing of the pipeline through a protected and environmentally sensitive area parallel to the Susquehanna River. The Board of Commissioners, working with several local organizations, went to Williams and expressed strong concerns regarding this route. Williams quickly found a new route and completely moved away from the sensitive areas, and did so with Native American sites and water source areas. Lancaster County has 5 significant pipelines running through our county. Many property owners are not even aware of the pipelines that crosses their land. Based upon discussions with local farmers having existing pipelines on their property, Williams, including with their major U.S. pipeline, has been very responsive to their needs. Lancaster County is one of the leaders in agricultural production, not only in Pennsylvania but across the country, but we also preserve more farmland than any other county in the United States, with over 100,000 acres preserved. Needless to say, the county ordinances that govern our farmland preservation program have allowed pipelines since inception. Since November of 2014, there have been 2 elections where the proposed pipeline was in a de facto manner on the ballot, and the voters were very clear in rejecting efforts to stop the proposed pipeline, including an effort to have 2 townships adopt a community-based ordinance that would essentially declare that federal and state laws do not apply in these municipalities. I believe that many of these voters clearly recognize that this pipeline represents the concept of a greater good being served. In closing, I want to again emphasize how incredibly important the ongoing energy revolution is to the future of the United States and indeed the world. While renewables, greater efficiencies, clean coal, next-generation nuclear, and a secure and smart grid are vitally important, it is really the virtually unlimited supply of clean, recoverable natural gas from shale that will lead America into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. And our next witness is Mr. Gerald Kepps, who's Vice President of Upstream Research and Consulting. And Mr. Kepps, thanks for being with us. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, thank you for having me here.
Did you turn your microphone on?
I'll do that. How about that? Is that coming across? Okay. Apologies for that. Mr. Chairman, members, thank you very much. I'm actually very pleased to be in front of you here today because in my world, which is...
Mr. Kepps, forgive me for interrupting. Would you mind taking Ms. Cassidy's microphone and try that one?
Push that again. Thank you very much. Again, my apologies. I hope this doesn't eat into my 5 minutes here. Mr. Chairman, members, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here today because the world that I usually am in is the business world in the exploration production business. I'm a geologist. I've been around the oil and gas industry for 30 years, so you can decide whether that makes me objective or not on this business, but I think I'm fairly knowledgeable. And I'm also representing the work and analysis and experience of my colleagues at my company. What I really want to talk today about is competitiveness of the E&P sector. And more than the volumes that have been produced, the new supplies from shale, just as important for you to think about is the incredible competitiveness of the energy industry right here. And the reason is that competitive basically means cost and efficiency in reaction to market conditions. So, for example, as we look at this low oil price period, which has many benefits for the economy, consumers, et cetera, at one point, clearly, perhaps the Saudis and others thought that the U.S. oil industry was just a phenomenon of high oil prices. That is not the case. In other words, many thought that this industry, the shale oil and gas industry, could survive only with high oil and gas prices. That is not the case. So it's actually one of my first points today. This is not a high oil price phenomenon. By the way, we've had low natural gas prices for about 6 years right now, and shale gas production has sustained, in fact grown. That's critically important. And why is that so important? Because when it comes to thinking about energy diplomacy and the idea that we can export the volumes that we have because we will match or meet our internal requirements, it's not just about volumes. What we're really exporting is competitiveness. And I want to make that point is that anything that you might consider in terms of these energy diplomacy objectives or goals, which are actually quite admirable, they will be sustainable and viable as long as this competitiveness exists. Because it's not just offering to send supply somewhere, the marketplace is what's pulling them. Whether it's to Ukraine or parts of Europe or Mexico, as I'll talk about next year, which is a great example, they wouldn't be doing this if these supplies exported from U.S. shores were not competitive and a lower priced alternative to other factors. This is particularly important because if we define very simply what energy security is, which is really, we would argue, reliable supply at affordable prices. So let's take Mexico. Right now, there's a lot of interest in Mexico because of the opening of the E&P sector, that's exploration production, because of the fact that we've had over 70 years of a monopoly of the state oil company Pemex going to be reversed. But that's actually not the biggest issue going on. The bigger issue is the fact that Mexico is going to be importing a lot more natural gas from the United States. I'm sure the committee knows that right now they import about 2 billion cubic feet a day. That number could go up to 5 or 6 billion cubic feet a day within the next 10 years. It's a bigger impact because two things. One, all this will drive much more gas-fired power generation if the reforms work in the midstream and downstream in Mexico, and we hope that they will. That should result in lower energy prices for the entire economy. We don't know yet if it's 10% lower or it's 30% lower, but the impact of that on the Mexican economy and competitiveness, this is actually the big picture. It's not so much the oil side, what I'm trying to say, it's the gas side and what we're about to do right there. That's a very important factor. Now, it is said, and it's quite true, that Mexico has substantial natural gas resources. But in this case, the decision that they made was if they tried to develop their own natural gas resources right now, it's so expensive that it made far more sense to import less expensive U.S. natural gas. That's a choice for competition. It's a choice for competitiveness. And again, if you want to look at it from a energy policy program for the U.S., a tremendous success because as this goes forward, that competitiveness, that lower price and efficiency is what is going to have a larger impact on the Mexican economy and a huge contributor to what has already been troubled at times, but a very successful U.S.-Mexican relationship. So that's the arguments I want to put in front of you. That one, shale production is not a high-price phenomena. Also, intrinsic to the supply volumes that we have, which is important, is the competitiveness of that. One, that if it's going to be part of U.S. energy diplomacy initiatives, then that competitiveness needs to continue. That's going to undergird all of that in order for it to be successful. And finally, U.S. infrastructure processes and regulations, naturally, have to be equally competitive in order to allow this to be sustained. Thank you very much for giving me the time.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Capson. Our next witness is Allison Cassidy, who is the Director of Domestic Energy Policy for the Center for American Progress. And Thank you very much for being with us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Allison Cassidy, and I am Director of Domestic Energy Policy for the Center for American Progress. CAP is a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the lives of Americans through progressive ideas and action. Before I jump into my more specific comments on the energy diplomacy section of the energy diplomacy discussion draft, I would like to highlight a topic that is not a subject of today's hearing, but I think should be, and that is climate change, which to me is the most urgent and challenging energy diplomacy issue of our time. Climate change has become a priority in international relations because the climate science is so clear. A failure to act on climate change risks severe, irreversible impacts on a global scale. As the committee considers the nation's energy policy and its interaction with the rest of the world, CAP urges you to put climate change front and center of any policy that you develop. We can no longer afford to separate energy policy from climate policy. So with that introductory context in mind, I'm going to jump into a few thoughts on Section 3104 of the discussion draft about cross-border energy projects. As you all know, under current law, entities wanting to construct or operate a cross-border pipeline or transmission line are required to obtain a presidential permit. This section of the bill eliminates that requirement and instead requires the relevant federal agency to issue a certificate of crossing. That is, unless the agency finds that the cross-border segment of the project is not in the public interest of the United States. And I have a few concerns about this approach. First, the new process presumes that the project is in the public interest, placing the burden of proof on concerned stakeholders to demonstrate that it is not, instead of asking the applicant to make the affirmative case that it is. Second, under the new process, the applicant only needs to obtain federal approval for the portion of the project that physically crosses the U.S. border, even if the project itself spans hundreds of miles. And finally, the new process limits environmental review under NEPA to just the cross-border section of the project. To me, this makes little sense since we all know that these types of projects can have environmental impacts well beyond the border. For a truly transcontinental project, such as a pipeline that runs through numerous states down to the Gulf Coast, the current presidential permitting process is the only venue for the public and stakeholders to examine and understand the potential impacts of the whole project that's under consideration. Under the process established by this bill, the review would be fragmented. It would be state by state, and no one except the project applicant would ever examine the project as a whole. I also have a few concerns about Section 3106, which is the LNG export section. This section sets a 30-day deadline upon the completion of environmental review for the DOE to issue a final decision on any application to export natural gas to a non-free trade country. The United States is well on track to becoming a net exporter of natural gas. To date, the DOE has issued final authorizations to 6 facilities to export up to 8.6 billion cubic feet per day of LNG. That's more than 10% of daily U.S. natural gas consumption, and that's on top of what we already export to free trade countries like Mexico. The existing DOE permitting system appears to be working. It puzzles me, therefore, why we need a bill that would seek to fast-track new DOE permit approvals. To be clear, CAP does not oppose LNG exports in principle, but we have concerns about placing an artificial deadline on agency review of permit applications. Congress should not preclude DOE from taking the time it needs to make a considered and well-informed decision, particularly on the most difficult projects. The stakes are simply too high for natural gas consumers here in the United States. Last year, the Energy Information Administration concluded that increased LNG exports lead to increased natural gas prices. And these higher natural gas prices create economic winners and losers. Certainly, natural gas producers and employees of natural gas producers would be clear winners. But, for example, manufacturers that use natural gas as a feedstock would face much higher energy costs. In short, the decision to export significant volumes of natural gas, even to our allies, is a complex one that should not be made lightly given the potential consumer impacts here in the United States. This decision is made even more complicated given the growing demand here at home for natural gas in both the electricity sector and the transportation sector. So if the United States overcommits to natural gas exports via long-term 20-year contracts, consumers here could pay the price. And that's why a deliberative process is so important. With that, I will end my testimony and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Cassidy. And our next witness is Ms. Emily Hammond, who is Professor of Law at George Washington University Law School. And thank you for joining us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and the distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. In my testimony, I would like to highlight several concerns that undermine the discussion draft's important goal of a unified energy policy. These concerns relate specifically to sections 3102, 3104, and 3106. In short, those provisions fail to properly account for the reliability, fuel diversity, and environmental implications of energy policy. And they also fail to adequately permit the energy agencies to undertake their work in a participatory, deliberative, and well-reasoned manner. Let me start with the Interagency Task Force. Despite that the lines between energy and the environment no longer truly exist, the composition of the task force has significant gaps that will hinder rather than help the development of a comprehensive energy policy. Most critical is the absence of agencies with environmental expertise. But other key agencies, like those whose missions relate to jobs, to the economy, and to transportation, are also omitted from the task force. As demonstrated by the QER, which we heard about this morning, all of these agencies can successfully work together toward unified energy policies. And administrative law will show that when agencies collaborate in this way, they are more successful and that they tend to have broader stakeholder support and they have reduced vulnerability to judicial challenges. For the same reasons, the criteria for the Interagency Task Force's plan should include environmental issues and especially climate change. Failing to do so will only deepen the current dysfunctions in our energy regulatory system and in the energy markets. Second, the authorization for cross-border infrastructure projects does not make clear how DOE would implement its authority differently from how it currently does under the presidential permit framework. Current procedures do account for environmental issues, and those should be retained. I note as well that the provisions striking portions of the Federal Power Act, and in particular Section 202F, threaten to undermine important backstop authority that the Federal Power Act retains for FERC that allow it to ensure grid reliability for intrastate projects that cross international boundaries. I urge the subcommittee to carefully re-examine the striking provisions of this section. Finally, the 30-day deadline for DOE action on LNG applications is of concern. Even if DOE is able to act quickly in some circumstances, it needs more flexibility, given the very complex issues at stake. Imposing a rigid deadline actually threatens more delay. First, deadline suits, which are contemplated by the discussion draft, tend to impose additional delays even if those suits are successful. And second, with stakes so high and such engaged stakeholders, judicial challenges are inevitable. All right, we can easily predict lawsuits no matter DOE's decision, and if DOE is rushed in making its determination, the record is less likely to be carefully developed, the agency's reasoning may not be clear, and once again, it is likely to be more vulnerable to judicial remand and imposition of even further delays. To summarize, the relationship between energy and the environment must be considered as the United States seeks a uniform energy policy. Careful attention to administrative procedure and its role in promoting good government must also accompany any new energy statutes. If we move forward with U.S. energy policy with these principles in mind, we can make substantial improvements for the future. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Ms. Hammond, and that concludes the opening statements. I just want to make an announcement that we're expecting some votes around 1:30 or so. There's only 6 members here, so we each get 5 minutes. That'll be 30 minutes. I think that we can make it through and give you all an opportunity to respond if we go efficiently and quickly. So I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes, make sure I get mine in, Bobby, and then we'll go from there. Ms. Cassidy and Ms. Hammond both made comments about climate change, and certainly that's something we're very much concerned about. But I would like to remind everyone that within the federal government, just the U.S. federal government, there are 68 different initiatives on climate change. There's been a total of about $36.7 billion spent by the U.S. government alone each year just on climate change. So the differences that we're having with President Obama, truthfully, is that he views it as the most important issue facing mankind, and some of us have different views that a job, access to health care, clean water, affordable energy, economic growth are very important also. So I appreciate your all's comments. And now Mr. Pallone's coming in. That's another person, so I'm going to have to hurry. Okay. I want to make that comment. Now, Dr. Dolzer, in France, they have a large percentage of their electricity produced from nuclear. Germany made the decision, I guess, to stop all production of energy by nuclear. Is that still the policy in Germany?
That is the policy. We decided 3 days after the Fukushima events in 2010 to phase out. We had an earlier change in 2000. Then we had another change in 2009, and Fukushima is still the key event in Germany. At the moment, my prediction is the current situation is that half of the nuclear plants have already been phased out after 2011, and the rest, the eight of them are still in operation. They will be phased out by 2021.
And of course, you all have been in Germany. They've been moving very quickly to renewable energy, wind, solar, whatever. So what has the result been? I mean, has it affected your reliability? Has it affected the retail prices of electricity or not?
It has affected the price of the consumer considerably. I think the price went up by about 30% for electricity for the private households. Perhaps one conclusion is, and I'm not here taking any particular position, if you change policies, do it in a pragmatic manner without too much momentary intervention. I think the change in Germany has forced us to react very quickly. It had some rather unintended consequences. At the moment, we are the main importer of U.S. coal. Now, of course, this is a little bit odd and awkward to have more coal.
I was told that last year 2/3 of U.S. coal exports went to Europe.
So we're supporting West Virginia. A consequence of our decision to phase out nuclear was de facto to promote coal. For the moment, my prediction is this policy will not change. None of the major political parties, including the one to which I belong, intends to change. However, I think if I listen to what my wife tells me, opposition among the people is growing to this policy. The question is that affordable, what we're doing at the moment in the long run? Germany has many issues, as most other states. We need more schools. We need better universities. We need more streets. And the question is, can we focus our budget in the way we did on one issue alone, which is
Yeah. When you, in your testimony, when you were talking about Europe being more vulnerable, is that what you were referring to?
that is correct.
The policy about the renewables and the push
Policy about renewables, together with the policy of phasing out nuclear power, means that we need more energy in the future as regards gas. We have a very special situation. We can get more gas from Russia, from Iran, from Algeria, or at the moment from Norway, but Norway is about to peak. In other words, our choices are not considerable. And here I would like to come back for a moment to U.S. policy. The U.S. has criticized us, of course, for being dependent too much on Russian gas. Correct, almost 40%. At the same time now, of course, in an era of abundance, one would hope, the Europeans would hope, that the United States allows for more gas to be exported to Europe in a situation where we need stronger support with our alternatives. And I think even small additional imports from the United States would help on a symbolic manner. In other words, the position in Europe that you hear quite often is, on the one hand, the U.S. criticizes that we are too dependent on Russia or Iraq or whoever.
Okay.
On the other hand, the U.S. does not allow and facilitate exports to Europe. I think this is a position that may be reconsidered.
Okay. At this time, we're going to recognize Mr. Rush for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just want to take a moment to welcome back to the committee Ms. Cassidy. She served for many, many years as an expert staffer under our former chairman, Henry Waxman, and she was on this side of the table, and now she's on that side of the table. But I just wanted to welcome her back. So good to see you again, and you're continuing your outstanding work. So thank you so very much. I want to ask you a question, and also Ms. Hammond. It's in response to the comments of the chairman. In your opinion, and both of you, if you would respond, are energy and environmental issues inherently related? And why is it so very, very important that any kind of comprehensive energy policy also integrate environmental concerns in that policy? And do either of you have any specific
You've got a great voice.
plan itself? Thank you.
Excellent.
I would just add to that, the energy infrastructure decisions we make today will last decades. So we decide to build a pipeline today or build a new energy production facility, we're locking in decades of new emissions or not. And that is why it's very important to consider, whenever we're considering energy policy, we should consider climate policy as well, and think through how will this energy project affect our transition, negatively or positively, toward a zero carbon future.
Gentleman yields back. Because we now have call votes, I'm going to reduce the amount of time for 3 minutes for everyone so that hopefully we can get everybody a chance. So, Mr. Olson, you recognize 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm with you. Welcome to all our witnesses. I apologize you got behind an energy superstar and now votes in a hearing coming in this hearing room about 2 o'clock. So I have one question for you, Mr. Grumet. It's about Mexico. As you mentioned in your testimony, Mexico is on the verge of a revolution for energy. Changes, changes, changes. I moved to Texas in 1972. I saw the stranglehold OPEC had on America firsthand. 1979, I just got my license. I was sent down to get in line for gasoline. Gasoline depended upon, you got a long line, you could get gas depending upon your last digit of your license plate. If it was an even date, go an even day, even number. Long lines, gas prices doubled. They had a stranglehold on us. Now, with all this new production in America, our neighbor to the north, Canada, and Mexico, I see a vision of OPEC going away, replaced by NAPEC, North American petroleum exporting countries. My question is, sir, what's the one thing we can, in Congress can do to help make that reality, make NAPEC head of OPEC?
Thank you for that question, and I will note that usually you put the warm-up band on before the rock stops. You might want to do that. Elvis comes to your committee. All right, I'm back. I think you make a very important point. We used to, look at our headlines, and OPEC was having a meeting, and there would be a chill through the land. Now, they can meet or not meet. It doesn't matter much to us if, in fact, we seize the opportunity of abundance. And I think our opportunities with Mexico are profound. We have to give a lot of credit to President Nieto for trying to reverse 60 years of investment policy that basically discouraged first world technology. I think the opportunities to spend a lot of time working with Mexico on something that is pedestrian but incredibly important, and that is data quality. The ability to have North American energy security depends on having good data, shared analysis, shared understandings, and a transparency across our analytical platforms. That's a very boring but incredibly difficult and important thing to do. Our energy administration here is the gold standard, and I think we really should spend a lot of time, and it's going to require some resources if we want Mexico to join us. If we have that shared data foundation and we have thoughtful laws that, as our colleagues have suggested, provide time for environmental deliberation, but then actually require a decision, I think we can have an integrated energy system that will raise both.
Shared data, number one. We need to have that in Congress. That's the best thing we do right now.
I think that's something you could actually get done right now. That would
That's
make it
even
very
better. I like that. Yield back, sir.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from New Jersey for 3 minutes, Mr. Plum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to follow up on a few statements made earlier today about Section 3104. This provision makes an end run around the National Environmental Policy Act and would eliminate meaningful review of the environmental impacts of proposed cross-border energy projects. And this section dramatically narrows the scope of environmental review to only the cross-border segment of the energy project, the tiny portion that physically crosses the national boundaries. So, Ms. Cassidy, does limiting NEPA review to just a small sliver of a cross-border energy project make any sense to you? And what are some of the drawbacks of looking at just the cross-border segment of a pipeline or transmission line?
Thank you for the question. No, it doesn't make much sense to me, simply because if you look at the more controversial pipeline and other projects that we've examined over the last few years, the controversy has never been around the impacts at the border. We all know even the best constructed, highest technology pipeline, an accident can happen. And those pipelines span hundreds of miles. They pass through sensitive ecosystems, over aquifers, over private and public lands. And an environmental review, the purpose of an environmental review is to make sure that policymakers have all of the facts about the impacts of the potential impacts of the project over the entire course of the project, not just the small part at the border, in order to better understand how to mitigate those potential impacts. So in order to understand the potential consequences of a project, we need to look at it in its entirety and not just at the border.
How about the legislation's presumption that cross-border projects are in the public interest? How would you How would looking at just the cross-border segment impact an agency's ability to determine whether or not a project's in the public interest?
The presumption of approval stacks the deck against a stakeholder who has legitimate concerns about whether or not a project is in the public interest. It forces the concerned stakeholder to make the case that it is not in the public interest, rather than forcing the applicant to make the case that it is. And that's just a higher burden of proof. And the way the bill is written, since it's so focused on a very narrow part of the proposal and doesn't look at all of the potential impacts, it's going to be much harder for a concerned stakeholder to make the case that this tiny little part of the project is not in the public interest.
Well, thank you. I think these energy infrastructure projects are a lot more than just a border crossing. They're going to last for decades, and fundamentally, NEPA requires us to look before we leap, but that's just basic common sense. So we should not be carelessly narrowing or creating loopholes in the law, and I think we need to understand the impact of these projects before they're constructed so that we can protect public health and safety and the environment, and I think ignoring the impacts is not going to make them disappear. So thank you again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Martin, Lancaster County doesn't have any wells of Marcellus shale being drilled in it. Probably the nearest well is 100 miles away. But how is Lancaster County benefiting from Marcellus shale, the boom that you mentioned, even if there are no wells being drilled in the county?
Well, first and foremost, what we have seen is, one, Pennsylvania put in forth an impact fee with monies that were distributed back not only to well counties, but also to counties who end up having pipelines. Those kinds of funds that are coming back are used to conserve open space, preserve ag preservation easements, and also really replace structurally deficient bridges. But we're also seeing the economic impact as well here. We have IT companies that do data mappings of pipelines and wells that have grown dramatically. Engineering firms, one of the larger engineering firms in the Marcellus Shale region, Ritu Engineering, more than doubled in size. Over a 2-year period, they bought an additional 75 vehicles. I used in my testimony examples of the Pennsylvania National Guard or Shady Maple. Shady Maple saving over 170, it's a smorgasbord. If anyone's ever been to one, I highly recommend it. $175,000 a year in energy costs, which then Garden Spot School District saw, which is in the same area, and said, we're going to tap in, and they're going to realize those savings. Now, we'd like to see more of it. Unfortunately, about half of Pennsylvanians do not have access to that natural gas. But given the premise of the open access nature of pipelines, you will start to see more of these entities like the Pennsylvania National Guard at Fort Indian Town Gap and others who are able to tap in and be able to realize that savings. And where we expect to see most of it and where we hear from a lot of our constituents is especially in the area of manufacturing, especially those who are heavily reliant on energy to do that. We have companies that spend over $3 million a year in energy costs, but they are nowhere near the nearest pipeline. So I think we'll see further opportunities coming forth. But I just want to add, Congressman, two of the great things I see is you're now able to get an education in Pennsylvania in the petroleum and gas industry that you had to go to like Texas Tech to used to be able to get. They're investing in areas, I think $2.5 million grant from the industry to Lackawanna Community College. 2-year program, cost for that 2 years about $22,000. And when they're coming out of that program, their starting rate is like $68,000. So those are the types of things that you're seeing. These are good middle-class jobs that not only use your head, but also use your hands. And we're seeing that grow, and that's something we hopefully continue to see grow, not only in Lancaster County, but throughout Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. My time's expired.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate hearing from the county commissioner. My accent gives me away, but obviously every school in Texas has energy courses from my community colleges all the way up to not only Texas Tech and Lubbock, but UT and A&M and University of Houston and everywhere else. Ms. Cassidy, I want to welcome you back to the committee. I know you're familiar with the NEPA regulations promulgated by the Council on Environmental Quality, not only from your work on the committee, but with the center. Under NEPA, an agency is specifically prohibited from segmenting projects known as piecemealing. The Code of Federal Regulations states proposals or parts of proposals which are related to each other closely enough to be in effect a single course of action are evaluated. The discussion draft requires the State Department to promulgate rules on cross-border pipelines, and you heard Secretary Moniz say that the agencies are required to do it. Ms. Cassidy, wouldn't the federal agency in charge of the environmental review be charged with the NEPA review that satisfies these CEQ regulations and looking at the whole project?
My understanding of the bill is that the NEPA review only applies to the cross-border segment of the pipeline project or the transmission line, and so the federal approval only applies to that portion as well. Therefore, NEPA would only apply to that portion. There would be state-by-state reviews if it was passing through a state. In terms of federal review, it just applies to the cross-border segment.
Well,
that's my understanding of the legislation.
Shouldn't the the cross-border review, but so much of our NEPA process is also done by other federal agencies and a party to it. For example, if you have a pipeline coming from Texas in Eagle Ford to Mexico, that cross-border pipeline, state law covers it on the property that's not federal, but it may be crossing federal lands, and so the NEPA process would come into play on that. But granted, the cross-border, which is international, of course, is taxpayers. We own our part of the border, then they would do it. But you don't think the bill calls for them to look at the whole project? And it may not be one agency doing it, but there will be other agencies doing a NEPA process on what they're required to do in that pipeline, from whether it be at Eagle Ford, of course, into Mexico. That's what worries me, because I know, and my colleague from New Jersey said that the NEPA process is not covered. I think it is, because if it's not Department of Energy, for example, for electricity transmission, it would be another federal agency if they had the authority in there, or in some cases state agencies. So the NEPA process would be included. And Mr. Chairman, I know I'm almost out of time, and we're almost out of time for.
Well, Mr. Green, that's our view as well, and we would love for our staff to sit down with Ms. Cassidy in more detail, but it is our understanding that this does not change the NEPA process.
Yeah. Now, I have to admit, in my few seconds, I have a problem with the State Department. We have a company in Texas who was a Canada pipeline that was dormant. They wanted to change the name because they bought it, and their goal was to not only bring crude oil from Canada, but it was also to attach into the United States from Balkan. And in the State Department decided they need to review what was on U.S. property. Now, I want a federal agency looking at it, but the State Department shouldn't be deciding whether a pipeline out of Balkan is good or not, because granted, we're getting crude oil in trains into Houston, Texas, because our refiners do that. It is so much safer and easier to put a pipeline in there than it is bring those 100-car trains full of crude oil from Canada.
Gentleman's time has expired. Recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right. I'll take anybody who can answer this. I suspect it'll be Mr. Grummett or Ms. Cassidy or Ms. Hammond. Are you all familiar with the regulations relating to production of electricity in Mexico by coal? It knows a fine answer. If you don't know, you don't know. Nobody knows. Because the reason I ask that question is that part of our proposal here, and one that I'm interested in, has electric transmission facilities. It's not just pipelines. And one of my concerns is that we're putting coal miners out of work in Appalachia, like Lancaster down our way. It's not Appalachia, it's Appalachia. And we're putting coal miners out of work in Appalachia, but if we allow electric transmission lines to cross over from Mexico using not as good a coal, with not as good a process, in not as clean a plants, what gain have we made environmentally? And I think this is a case where, while Ms. Cassidy and I are not going to agree on much, we might actually agree on that ought to be a concern. Mr. Grummett, do you have any thoughts on that at all?
I think you make a very important point, and Dr. Dolzer's testimony referred to it as well, right? Electrons and molecules don't have a lot of concern about arbitrary political boundaries, and that's why we actually have to have a shared solution that brings the technology of the United States to bear on the issues in Mexico. We have to have shared agreements. I'm not going to try to get into a lengthy conversation about regional climate action in 60 seconds, but
Well.
I think there's a real opportunity to actually lift the Mexican system so that it actually has parity with the U.S.
And I certainly don't mind lifting up the Mexican system, but I am reminded of the old NASA study that shows it takes 10 days for the air to get from the middle of the Gobi Desert to the eastern shore of Virginia. So if we're going to eliminate coal, waiting another 30 or 40 years on Asia just really means we're putting our people out of work, and we're not really doing that much for the overall northern hemisphere.
All I will say is
air.
that we fundamentally have to find a way to burn coal in a way that meets our security interests and our environmental interests, and there's one way we can do that if we invest the resources to get it done. We're not doing that right now.
And I agree with you completely. We can do more, and we should do more. I look forward to working with you on clean coal technologies. I yield.
And there are no other questions, so thank all of you once again for your patience, and we look forward to maintaining contact with you and continuing to work with you as we try to bring this legislation to the committee. I'm also asking unanimous consent that a statement from the Canadian Electricity Association be submitted for the record, and without objection, so ordered. Is this it? Okay. And we're going to keep the record open for 10 days for any additional material that may need to be submitted. And once again, that'll conclude today's hearing. Thank you all for your interest. And Mr. Dozer, thanks for coming all the way from Germany.